I've always been fascinated by the macabre. There's a certain morbid curiosity that draws me to the darker corners of the internet. That's how I stumbled upon it, an app on the dark web promising a hyper-realistic simulation of your own death. Against my better judgment, I bought it. The premise was simple. You customize the scenario. The app uses biofeedback to immerse you completely, and you experience your final moments. What happened next? Well, I'm still trying to process it. Each time I ran the simulation, something went horribly wrong, and each time my heart stopped. Here are those stories. My name is Ethan Miller, and if you were to ask anyone who knows me, they'd probably describe me as a bit of a tech enthusiast, maybe even a borderline obsessive. I've always been drawn to the bleeding edge of technology, the stuff that blurs the line between the real and the digital. While my friends were out chasing fleeting trends or getting lost in the latest social media drama, I was usually holed up in my apartment, tinkering with some new gadget, diving into the intricacies of a complex piece of software, or exploring the vast, often unsettling corners of the internet. I'm 28 years old, living in a relatively quiet suburb just outside of Seattle. I work as a software developer for a mid-sized tech company, a job that thankfully feeds my insatiable curiosity and provides me with the financial means to indulge my technological whims. My apartment, which I've meticulously customized over the years, is a testament to this passion. It's less of a living space and more of a high-tech sanctuary, filled with smart devices, custom-built computers, and a collection of virtual reality headsets that would make even the most seasoned gamer envious. My fascination isn't just limited to productivity or entertainment. I have a particular interest in simulations. The idea of creating and experiencing hyper-realistic virtual environments has always captivated me. I've spent countless hours exploring meticulously crafted worlds, from historical recreations to fantastical landscapes. There's something profoundly compelling about the ability to step outside of your own reality, even if just for a little while, and experience something completely different. It was this very fascination that led me down a rather peculiar and, as I would soon discover, deeply disturbing path. A few weeks ago, while browsing some obscure tech forums, I stumbled upon a mention of an experimental application. It wasn't available on any of the major app stores. It was something that had been circulating within a small private online community. The description was vague, bordering on cryptic, but the few users who had tried it spoke of an unprecedented level of realism in its simulations. Intrigued, and perhaps a little foolishly, I managed to track down a download link. The application was simply titled Eidolon. There was no accompanying website, no developer information, just the executable file. It felt clandestine, almost forbidden, which only heightened my curiosity. I ran a thorough scan for any malicious software, and when it came back clean, I decided to take the plunge. The interface was surprisingly minimalist, a stark black screen with a single prompt: enter simulation parameters. There were no preset scenarios, no tutorials, nothing to guide you. It was entirely up to the user to define the experience. This level of control was both exciting and a little daunting. Where do you even begin? After a few moments of contemplation, a morbid curiosity took hold. I've always been fascinated in a detached and intellectual way by extreme events, the kind of experiences that most people, thankfully, never have to endure. And so I typed in my first set of parameters: high-speed car accident, rural highway, nighttime, rain. I clicked initiate, and the screen flickered, then went completely black. For a moment, nothing happened, and I wondered if the application was even working. Then, a low rumble started to build in my headphones, a sound that gradually intensified, morphing into the distinct hum of an engine. The sensation was subtle at first, but it quickly grew more immersive. I felt a slight vibration through my chair, as if I were actually sitting in a car. Then the world exploded into sensory overload. The piercing glare of headlights cutting through the torrential rain, the rhythmic sweep of the windshield wipers, the faint smell of damp leather from the simulated car interior. It was all incredibly vivid. I felt the familiar weight of a seatbelt across my chest, the cool touch of the steering wheel beneath my hands. The simulation began innocuously enough. I was driving down a dark, winding road, the rain lashing against the windshield. The visibility was poor, and the headlights of oncoming vehicles seemed to appear out of nowhere, momentarily blinding me. There was a sense of unease, a primal awareness of the inherent danger of driving in such conditions, but it wasn't overwhelming. Then it happened, a split second of distraction. Perhaps I glanced at the simulated rear-view mirror, or maybe a particularly bright flash of lightning momentarily disoriented me. Whatever the cause, I saw it too late. A pair of headlights emerged from the darkness, a head impossibly close, filling my entire field of vision. My simulated mind reacted instantly, a surge of pure, unadulterated panic. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching in protest against the wet asphalt. The anti-lock braking system kicked in with a rapid, juddering pulse, but it was no use. The distance was too short, the speed too high. The screech of tires was deafening, a high-pitched wail that seemed to tear through the virtual air. Then came the sickening crunch of metal as the two vehicles collided. The force of the impact was brutal, throwing me forward against my seatbelt with violent intensity. I felt a jolt that resonated through my entire simulated body, a jarring, bone-rattling sensation that felt terrifyingly real. The world became a chaotic blur of shattered glass, twisted metal, and flashing lights. The sounds were overwhelming. The continued screeching of tires, the groaning and tearing of metal, the shattering of glass, all blending together into a cacophony of destruction. There was a fleeting, disoriented sense of tumbling and spinning, as if the car were rolling over. Then, everything came to a sudden, violent stop. The abrupt cessation of motion was almost as shocking as the impact itself. The sounds gradually faded, replaced by a ringing silence in my simulated ears. I felt a strange, heavy pressure on my chest, as if a great weight had been placed upon it. Darkness descended. Not the gradual fading of light, but an instantaneous absolute void. It was as if someone had simply flipped a switch, plunging me into complete and utter blackness. Along with the darkness came a profound sense of stillness, an absence of all sensation. The ringing in my ears subsided, replaced by an eerie quiet, and then I felt it, a cold stillness in my chest. It was a sensation unlike anything I had ever experienced, even in my most vivid nightmares. It wasn't pain, not exactly. It was more like an absence, a void where I expected to feel something vital. There was no heartbeat, no rise and fall of breath, just a cold, empty stillness. A wave of pure, primal terror washed over me. This wasn't just a simulation anymore, it felt real. The darkness pressed in on me, suffocating and absolute. The stillness in my chest grew more profound, more unsettling. It was as if my very life force was slowly ebbing away. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it ended. I jolted awake, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest like a trapped bird. My body was drenched in a cold sweat, my hands trembling uncontrollably. The virtual reality headset was still strapped to my face, the lenses displaying the stark black screen of the application. I ripped the headset off, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The familiar surroundings of my apartment swam into focus, but they felt strangely alien, as if I had just returned from a long and terrifying journey. My heart was still racing, a frantic drumbeat against my ribs. I could feel the lingering phantom sensation of the impact, the jarring jolt, the crushing pressure on my chest. My eyes darted back to the computer screen where the application window was still open. A chilling message was displayed in stark, white text against the black background. Simulation concluded. Subject experienced cardiac arrest. I stared at the message, my blood running cold. Cardiac arrest in the simulation. But the feeling, it had been so real. The cold stillness, the absence of life in my chest, it had felt utterly and terrifyingly genuine. A shiver ran down my spine, despite the warmth of my apartment. It was just a simulation, I told myself. A very realistic simulation, perhaps. Too realistic. But still, just lines of code, algorithms designed to mimic the sensations of a traumatic event. Yet, the doubt lingered. The feeling had been so visceral, so profoundly unsettling. Could a computer program truly replicate the sensation of your heart stopping? Could it evoke such a deep and primal fear of death? I closed the application, a sense of unease settling in my stomach. I tried to rationalize it, to dismiss it as just a particularly effective piece of software. But the image of that chilling message, the memory of that cold stillness in my chest, refused to fade. A vision. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning in bed, the simulated car crash replaying in my mind, the screech of tires, the crunch of metal, the sudden violent stop. And then, the darkness, the stillness. It was a memory that felt less like a simulated experience and more like a genuine trauma. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind, to focus on work and my daily routine. But the feeling of unease persisted, a nagging doubt that wouldn't go away. I found myself constantly checking my pulse, as if to reassure myself that my heart was still beating, still there. That evening, I found myself drawn back to my computer. The Eidolon application icon sat on my desktop, a silent, ominous invitation. I knew I shouldn't, but the morbid curiosity was too strong to resist. What was it about this application that felt so different, so unsettlingly real? I double-clicked the icon, and the stark black screen with the single prompt reappeared. This time I hesitated. The memory of the previous simulation was still too vivid, too disturbing. But the allure of the unknown, the desire to understand what had happened, ultimately won out. I decided to try a different scenario. Something less violent, less final. I typed in deep sea diving, submersible malfunction, rapid depressurization. I clicked initiate, and once again, the world around me dissolved into darkness. The simulation had begun, and this time, I had a growing sense of dread, a feeling that I was venturing into something far more profound and potentially dangerous than I could ever have imagined. The glitch in the machine, whatever it was, had somehow touched something deep within me, and I had a terrible feeling that I was about to find out just how deep that went. The transition into the deep-sea diving simulation was seamless, almost unnervingly so. One moment, I was sitting in my apartment, the familiar hum of my computer filling the air. The next, I was enveloped in a profound silence, broken only by the faint, rhythmic whooshing sound of my own breathing within the confines of the simulated submersible. The initial descent was gradual, a slow and steady journey into the crushing depths of the ocean. Through the thick, reinforced viewport of the virtual submersible, the sunlight above grew fainter and fainter, eventually fading into an inky blackness. The only illumination came from the powerful floodlights mounted on the exterior of the vessel, cutting through the dark water and revealing a strange and alien world. Schools of bioluminescent fish flickered past, their ethereal glows creating fleeting patterns of light in the darkness. Strange, otherworldly creatures drifted by, their forms both beautiful and unsettling. The immense pressure of the deep ocean was palpable, a silent, invisible force that seemed to press in on the submersible. From all sides, I could almost feel the weight of the water, the sheer volume of the ocean above me. The simulation was incredibly detailed. The subtle creaks and groans of the submersible under pressure, the faint hiss of the oxygen tanks, the almost imperceptible sway of the vessel as it navigated the currents. It all felt so real, so immersive. I found myself holding my breath instinctively at times, a primal reaction to the alien environment. As we descended further, the sense of isolation intensified. The surface, with its promise of air and light, felt like a distant memory. Down, here in the crushing darkness of the abyss, we were alone, surrounded by an environment utterly hostile to human life. There was a certain thrill to it, an adventurous spirit awakened by exploring this hidden realm. But beneath the surface of that excitement, a faint undercurrent of unease began to stir. Then, the malfunction occurred. It started subtly, a high-pitched whine that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the machinery of the submersible. The whine grew louder, more insistent, accompanied by a series of unsettling clicks and groans. Through the viewport, I saw a shower of sparks erupt from a panel near the front of the vessel. A jolt of simulated electricity coursed through the submersible, causing the lights to flicker erratically. Alarms began to blare, a cacophony of piercing sounds that echoed within the confined space. A synthesized voice, calm yet urgent, announced, "Warning, hull integrity compromised. Rapid depressurization imminent." Panic surged through me, even though I knew it was just a simulation. The feeling was visceral, primal. The thought of being trapped thousands of feet beneath the surface, the pressure outside threatening to crush us like an eggshell, was terrifying. The pressure inside the submersible began to drop rapidly. My simulated ears popped painfully, a sharp, stabbing sensation. The temperature plummeted, and a thin layer of frost began to form on the inside of the viewport. I felt a crushing sensation on my chest, a tightening in my lungs as the air thinned. Vision started to blur, and a wave of dizziness washed over me. I tried to gasp for breath, but my lungs felt like they were filled with lead. The alarms continued to shriek, the synthesized voice repeating its dire warning. The world around me began to spin, and the darkness at the edges of my vision grew wider. The last thing I saw in the simulation was the viewport cracking, a spiderweb of fractures spreading across its surface. Then, the darkness closed in, absolute and suffocating. I felt a final, agonizing squeeze, as if my body were being compressed from all sides. And then, nothing. I jolted awake again, this time with a gasp that felt even more desperate than before. My heart was pounding erratically, and my body was trembling violently. The phantom sensation of crushing pressure lingered on my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I ripped off the headset, my eyes wide with terror. The familiar comfort of my apartment felt fragile, almost illusory. The deep-sea simulation had been even more terrifying than the car accident. The feeling of helplessness, of being trapped in an inescapable and hostile environment, had been profoundly disturbing. The computer screen displayed the same chilling message. Simulation concluded. Subject experienced barotrauma and hypoxia. Barotrauma. Hypoxia. Medical terms describing the effects of rapid pressure changes and oxygen deprivation. The application wasn't just simulating events. It seemed to be simulating the physiological consequences as well. This level of detail was far beyond anything I had ever encountered in a simulation before. A cold dread began to creep into my mind. What exactly was this Eidolon application? Who created it, and what was its purpose? The realism was unsettling, almost too perfect. It felt like more than just advanced programming. There was a disturbing level of accuracy in the simulated sensations, particularly the ones related to physical trauma and the cessation of life. I tried to shake off the lingering fear, to tell myself that it was just a game, a very advanced piece of software. But the experiences felt too real, the emotions too intense. The memory of the crushing pressure, the burning in my lungs, the terror of the impending implosion. It all felt like a genuine trauma etched into my mind. Over the next few days, I found myself increasingly preoccupied with the Eidolon application. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something deeply wrong with it, something beyond the realm of normal technology. The simulations were too vivid, too visceral. They left me feeling drained and emotionally raw, as if I had actually lived through those terrifying events. Despite the fear and unease, a morbid curiosity continued to draw me back to the application. It was like an addiction, a dark and dangerous fascination. I felt compelled to explore its limits, to understand the source of its unsettling realism. I tried other simulations: a plane crash, a house fire, a fall from a great height. Each experience was a descent into pure terror, a hyper-realistic nightmare that left me gasping for breath when I finally jolted awake. And each time, the application displayed a clinical, detached message describing the simulated cause of death or injury. With each simulation, the line between the virtual and the real seemed to blur further. I started experiencing phantom sensations in my waking life. The faint smell of burning wood after the house fire simulation, the fleeting feeling of weightlessness after the fall. These sensations were brief and subtle, but they were enough to send a shiver of unease down my spine. I also noticed a change in my dreams. They became more vivid, more intense, often echoing the scenarios I had experienced in the Eidolon simulations. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the lingering fear from the virtual experience bleeding into my reality. The chilling message from the car accident simulation, "Subject experienced cardiac arrest," continued to haunt me. It was the first simulation I had tried, and it had left the most profound impact. The feeling of my heart stopping, the cold stillness in my chest, had been so utterly convincing. One night, I decided to revisit that first simulation. I typed in the exact same parameters: high-speed car accident, rural highway, nighttime, rain. The experience was just as terrifying as the first time, perhaps even more so, knowing what was coming. The screech of tires, the crunch of metal, the violent stop, and then the darkness, the stillness in my chest. This time, however, something was different. As I lay in the simulated darkness, feeling the cold stillness in my chest, I became aware of something else, a faint whisper, just at the edge of my hearing. It was a low, indistinct murmur, like the rustling of leaves or the distant sound of voices. I strained my simulated ears to hear it better, but the whisper remained elusive, just a faint presence in the void. It wasn't a sound that seemed to originate from the simulation itself. It felt external, almost like it was coming from somewhere beyond the confines of the virtual world. Then, the whisper seemed to coalesce, to form into something more coherent. It was still faint, but I could now make out individual sounds, almost like words being spoken in a language I didn't understand. The tone was low and mournful, carrying a sense of profound sadness and despair. The feeling of cold stillness in my chest intensified, becoming almost unbearable. The darkness seemed to press in on me, suffocating and absolute. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, swirling around me like a vortex of sorrow. Suddenly, a single word cut through the murmur, clear and distinct. Ethan. My simulated heart, which had been still just moments before, seemed to lurch in my chest. My eyes snapped open in the darkness, though there was nothing to see. The whisper had spoken my name. Terror, raw and absolute, gripped me. This was no longer just a simulation. Something was happening, something that defied explanation. The Eidolon application wasn't just replicating reality, it was somehow interacting with something else, something unknown and terrifying. Jolted awake, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. This time, the transition back to reality felt different. There was a lingering sense of dread, a feeling that I had brought something back with me from the simulation. The computer screen displayed the familiar message, "Simulation concluded, subject experienced cardiac arrest." But this time, the message seemed to carry a new weight, a more sinister implication. I looked around my apartment, the familiar objects seeming somehow alien, tainted by the darkness I had just experienced. The faint whisper seemed to echo in my ears, the sound of my name hanging in the air. I knew with a chilling certainty that I had stumbled upon something far more dangerous than I could have ever imagined. The Eidolon application wasn't just a simulation, it was a doorway, a gateway to something dark and unknown. And I had a terrible feeling that I had only just begun to scratch the surface of its terrifying secrets. The glitch in the machine wasn't just a technical anomaly, it was a glimpse into something that should have remained hidden. And now it knew my name. The sound of my name, whispered in the simulated darkness, clung to me like a shroud. It wasn't just a memory, it was a presence, a chilling echo that resonated in the silence of my apartment long after I had ripped off the headset. I spent the rest of that night in a state of anxious wakefulness, every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window, sending a jolt of fear through me. The rational part of my brain desperately tried to find an explanation. It had to be a glitch, a sophisticated audio cue buried deep within the application's code that had somehow been triggered at that specific moment. Maybe it was designed to enhance the realism, to make the simulated death feel even more personal and impactful. But the tone of the whisper, the clear enunciation of my name, it felt too deliberate, too knowing. The next morning I felt exhausted and on edge. The thought of going to work was unbearable, but I forced myself to go through the motions of my routine, hoping that the normalcy of everyday life would somehow dispel the lingering dread. It didn't. The memory of the whisper, the feeling of being addressed in that void, stayed with me like a persistent shadow. Throughout the day, I found myself constantly checking for any sign of the Eidolon application on my work computer, even though I knew I hadn't installed it there. I kept glancing over my shoulder, feeling an irrational sense of being watched. The world around me seemed subtly different, tinged with a faint layer of unease. That evening, I decided I needed to know more about this application. The silence surrounding it was too suspicious. I went back to the obscure tech forums where I had first heard about Eidolon, hoping to find more information, perhaps even the identity of the developer. The forum was small and relatively inactive, with most of the posts dating back several months. The discussion about Eidolon was limited to a single thread, started by an anonymous user with the handle Night Whisperer. The initial post simply contained a link to the application, followed by the cryptic message, "Experience the ultimate reality. Tread carefully." The subsequent replies were a mix of cautious curiosity and outright skepticism. Some users reported experiencing the same intense realism that I had, while others dismissed it as an elaborate hoax. There were a few mentions of unsettling occurrences, phantom sensations and vivid nightmares, but nothing as specific or disturbing as my experience with the whispered name. I tried to contact Night Whisperer through a private message, but the user's profile was bare, with no information and no recent activity. It was a dead end. I searched online for any mention of an application called Eidolon outside of this forum, but my efforts yielded nothing. It was as if the application existed only in this hidden corner of the internet. Driven by a desperate need for answers, I decided to delve deeper into the application itself. I copied the Eidolon executable file onto a separate hard drive and disconnected my computer from the internet just in case. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I felt a growing sense that this application was far more complex and potentially dangerous than it appeared. Using a hex editor, I started to examine the code. It was a tangled mess of complex algorithms and encrypted data far beyond my usual level of expertise. There were no obvious clues, no developer names or copyright information. It was as if the application had simply materialized out of thin air. I spent hours poring over the code, trying to decipher its secrets, but I made little progress. The more I looked, the more I felt like I was peering into an abyss, a vast and incomprehensible void. There was a sense of intricate design, of meticulous planning, but the purpose behind it remained elusive. Frustrated and exhausted, I eventually gave up. I felt more lost and confused than ever. The application remained an enigma, its origins and true nature shrouded in mystery. Over the next few days, the unsettling occurrences in my real life began to escalate. The phantom sensations became more frequent and more intense. I would catch fleeting glimpses of shadows in the periphery of my vision, only to find nothing there when I turned my head. I started hearing faint whispers when I was alone. Whispers that sounded eerily similar to the ones I had heard in the simulation. At first, I dismissed these experiences as the result of stress and an overactive imagination. But they became increasingly persistent and disturbing, making it harder and harder to ignore them. I started to feel like I was being watched, not just in my apartment, but everywhere I went. There was a constant sense of unease, a feeling that unseen eyes were following my every move. One evening I decided to try another simulation, hoping that perhaps understanding the application better would somehow alleviate the growing fear. This time, I chose a scenario that was less focused on physical trauma. Solitary confinement, total sensory deprivation, indefinite duration. The simulation began with an abrupt transition into absolute darkness and silence. There was no sensation of touch, no smell, no taste. It was a void, a complete absence of sensory input. Initially, there was a strange sense of calm, a feeling of being completely disconnected from the outside world. But as the simulation continued, the silence became deafening, the darkness oppressive. My mind began to race, filling the void with a torrent of thoughts and anxieties. I tried to focus on something, anything, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the whispered name, to the unsettling feeling of being watched. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the sensory deprivation. Minutes stretched into hours, hours into an eternity. The isolation became unbearable, a crushing weight on my mind. I started to hallucinate, seeing fleeting images in the darkness, hearing faint whispers that seemed to come from within my own thoughts. Then the whispers became clearer, more distinct. They were the same mournful tones I had heard in the car accident simulation, the same indistinct murmur that seemed to carry a profound sense of sadness. And then, just as before, a single word cut through the darkness. Ethan. This time the voice felt closer, more intimate, as if it were right beside me, whispering directly into my ear. The terror that gripped me was even more intense than before. This wasn't just a glitch. It was something else, something that seemed to be reaching out to me across the boundaries of the simulation and into my own mind. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to move, but my simulated body felt heavy and unresponsive. I was trapped in the void, surrounded by darkness and the chilling whispers that knew my name. Suddenly, the darkness shifted, and a faint image began to form in front of me. It was blurry and indistinct at first, but it gradually came into focus. I saw a face, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into my soul. The face was vaguely familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. There was a profound sadness in its expression, a look of utter despair. The whispers intensified, swirling around me like a chorus of tormented souls. The face in front of me began to move, its lips forming words that I couldn't quite hear. It was like trying to listen to someone speaking underwater, the sounds muffled and distorted. Then, one word broke through the cacophony, clear and chilling. Help. The image of the face flickered and then vanished, plunging me back into the absolute darkness and silence. But the word lingered in my mind, an echo of desperation that resonated deep within me. I jolted awake, this time feeling utterly drained and terrified. The sensory deprivation simulation had been the most disturbing experience yet. The feeling of isolation, the hallucinations, the whispered name, the face, it all felt too real, too personal. I knew then that I couldn't dismiss this as just a game anymore. Something was happening, something connected to the Eidolon application that was starting to bleed into my reality in a terrifying way. The whispers weren't just in the simulations, they were starting to follow me. Over the next few days, the feeling of being watched intensified. I started noticing subtle changes in my apartment. Objects moved slightly, doors left ajar, a faint musty smell that I couldn't identify. I would hear faint footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment, even when I knew I was alone. One evening, I was sitting at my computer trying to work when I noticed something strange on my screen. The Eidolon application icon, which I had moved to the separate hard drive, had reappeared on my desktop. I hadn't moved it back. A wave of cold dread washed over me. How had it gotten there? I hadn't plugged in the external hard drive in days. Someone or something had moved it. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the icon. It seemed to pulse faintly on the screen, as if it were alive. I felt an irresistible urge to click on it, to delve back into its terrifying world. But a primal instinct screamed at me to stay away, to run as far as possible. As I hesitated, the icon began to glow brighter, and a faint whisper seemed to emanate from my computer speakers, even though the volume was turned all the way down. It was my name, spoken in the same mournful tone I had heard in the simulations. I recoiled from the computer, knocking my chair over in my haste. I scrambled backwards, my eyes fixed on the screen, watching in horror as the Eidolon application launched itself. The stark black screen appeared, and the single prompt blinked ominously. Enter simulation parameters. But this time the prompt was already filled in. The text read, Ethan Miller, your final experience. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me. This wasn't just a simulation anymore, this was something else, something that knew my name, knew my fears, and was now coming for me. The echo in reality had become a deafening roar, and I was trapped in its terrifying embrace. The glitch had become a haunting, and I had a sickening feeling that my final simulation had already begun. The words on the screen, Ethan Miller, your final experience, seemed to burn into my retinas. My breath hitched in my throat, a strangled gasp of pure, unadulterated terror. I tried to scramble away from the computer, but my legs felt like lead, rooted to the floor by an invisible force. My eyes remained glued to the screen, watching as the black background began to shift and swirl like ink spreading in water. The familiar hum of the simulation starting filled the room, but this time it was different. It wasn't the neutral, ambient sound of a generic virtual environment. This hum was low, resonant, and carried an undertone of something deeply malevolent, something ancient and hungry. It vibrated through the floorboards, through my chair, through my very bones. The blackness on the screen began to coalesce, forming into a scene that was both familiar and utterly wrong. I was standing in my apartment, but it was distorted, twisted, into a nightmarish parody of the place I called home. The walls seemed to breathe, the shadows writhed with unseen life, and the air was thick with a cloying, sweet scent that made my stomach churn. I tried to move, to flee this digital perversion of my sanctuary, but I found myself unable to control my own body. I was a mere observer, trapped within my own perspective as the simulation unfolded around me. A figure emerged from the shadows in my living room. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long and thin. Its face was pale and indistinct, shrouded in shadow, but I could feel its gaze fixed on me, a cold, piercing stare that seemed to penetrate my very soul. The figure began to move towards me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet controlled by unseen strings. As it drew closer, I could hear a faint whispering sound, the same mournful murmur that had haunted me in the previous simulations. The whispers grew louder, swirling around me, carrying fragments of sorrow and despair. Then, the figure spoke. Its voice was a dry, rasping whisper, like the sound of bones scraping together. "Ethan," it said, my name drawn out in a chilling, elongated tone. Terror seized me, a cold, paralyzing grip that squeezed the air from my lungs. This was the face from the sensory deprivation simulation, now rendered in horrifying detail. The hollow eyes stared into me, filled with an ancient sadness and a predatory hunger. The figure reached out a long, skeletal hand towards me. Its touch felt cold, like ice, burning through my skin even though I knew it wasn't real. A wave of dizziness washed over me, and the distorted version of my apartment began to spin. The scene shifted again, dissolving into a swirling vortex of colors and shapes. I felt like I was falling, tumbling through an endless abyss, the whispers echoing around me, growing louder and more insistent. Then I found myself back in the car accident simulation, the rain lashing against the windshield, the headlights cutting through the darkness. But this time, I wasn't just observing. I was behind the wheel, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my foot hovering over the accelerator. The familiar terror of the impending crash flooded through me, amplified 100-fold. I knew what was coming, the screech of tires, the crunch of metal, the sudden violent stop. But this time I couldn't look away. I was forced to experience it, to live through the final moments of my simulated death. The other car appeared out of nowhere, its headlights blinding me. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming in protest. The impact was even more brutal than before, throwing me forward. Against the seatbelt with bone-jarring force, the world became a chaotic blur of shattered glass and twisted metal. The sounds of the crash were deafening, overwhelming, and then the sudden violent stop, followed by the all-encompassing darkness. The cold stillness descended upon my chest, more profound and more terrifying than ever before. It wasn't just a lack of sensation. It was an active absence, a void where my life force should have been. But this time the darkness wasn't empty. I could feel a presence beside me, the same gaunt figure from my apartment, its cold gaze fixed on me in the void. The whispers intensified, swirling around us, a chorus of mournful voices. The figure leaned closer, its breath cold against my ear. "This is your final experience, Ethan," it whispered, its voice a chilling caress. "Join us." A wave of pure, primal fear washed over me. I knew what it meant. This wasn't just a simulation of death. It was an invitation, a beckoning to the other side. I tried to fight, to resist, but I was powerless, trapped within the confines of the application. The cold stillness in my chest grew, spreading through my entire body, extinguishing the last vestiges of warmth and life. The whispers became a deafening roar, and the darkness around me began to shift and change, forming into a landscape of shadows and despair. I saw other figures in the darkness, pale and gaunt, their hollow eyes filled with the same profound sadness and longing. They reached out to me, their touch cold and inviting. I felt myself being drawn towards them, pulled into the darkness, the last vestiges of my consciousness fading away. The line between the simulation and reality had completely dissolved. I was no longer Ethan Miller, the software developer in his Seattle apartment. I was just another shadow in the void, another voice in the mournful chorus. Then everything went silent. The darkness became absolute, devoid of even the faintest whisper. There was no sensation, no thought, no awareness. There was only the void. Back in my apartment, the computer screen went black. The hum of the application ceased. The room was silent, still. The chair lay overturned on the floor where I had fallen. A faint, musty smell lingered in the air. Days turned into weeks. My apartment remained silent, the curtains drawn, the mail piling up at the door. My colleagues at work grew concerned when I didn't show up, their calls and messages going unanswered. Eventually, someone contacted the building manager, who opened my apartment to find it empty. The computer was still on, the screen dark. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of what had happened. The only unusual thing was the external hard drive plugged into the computer with a single application file on it. Eidolon. The hard drive was taken into evidence, the application analyzed by experts. They found nothing out of the ordinary, just lines of complex code that defied easy explanation. There was no trace of any external server connection, no indication of where the application had come from. It was a ghost in the machine, a digital enigma. The case of Ethan Miller was eventually closed as a missing person. Some speculated that he had simply left, seeking a new life elsewhere. Others whispered darker theories, tales of online cults and dangerous virtual reality experiences. But no one ever discovered the truth about Eidolon, about the final simulation, about the whispers in the darkness, and sometimes late at night, when the silence is heavy and the shadows seem to dance. A faint whisper can be heard, just at the edge of hearing, a mournful murmur that sounds eerily like a name. Ethan, and somewhere, in the endless void beyond the screen, perhaps Ethan is still experiencing his final simulation, forever trapped in the cold stillness, surrounded by the whispers of the lost, a chilling testament to the terrifying power of a reality that blurs the lines between the digital and the real, and the unknown horrors that might lie waiting just beyond the screen. The glitch in the machine had become a permanent haunting, a silent scream trapped within the code, forever echoing in the empty space where a life once was. My name is Jessica, and I've always been drawn to the darker corners of existence. Not in a self-destructive way, at least not intentionally. It's more of a morbid curiosity, a fascination with the edges of human experience that most people actively avoid. While my friends were binging rom-coms and planning beach vacations, I found myself engrossed in true crime documentaries and psychological thrillers. There was a certain allure in understanding the extremes of emotion, the breaking points of the human psyche. This fascination eventually led me down a digital rabbit hole, exploring the fringes of virtual reality. I dabbled in horror games, of course, the kind that rely on jump scares and grotesque imagery. They were momentarily effective, a quick jolt of adrenaline, but they always felt superficial, like a haunted house attraction designed to startle rather than truly unsettle. I craved something more profound, something that could tap into the primal fears that lie dormant within us all. That's how I stumbled upon Abyss, a VR application that promised hyper-realistic simulations of various life-threatening scenarios. It wasn't your typical game. There were no points to score, no enemies to defeat. It was purely experiential, designed to push the boundaries of sensory immersion. The descriptions were unsettlingly detailed, ranging from the sensation of free-falling, from an unimaginable height to the crushing weight of being buried alive. Each simulation was meticulously crafted, utilizing advanced haptic feedback and binaural audio to create an experience that blurred the line between virtual and reality. The one that truly caught my attention, the one that burrowed its way into my thoughts and refused to let go, was the drowning simulation. I know it sounds macabre, perhaps even disturbing to some. Why would anyone willingly subject themselves to such a terrifying experience? But for me, it was about understanding, about confronting a fear that is deeply ingrained in the human condition. The thought of suffocating, of the lungs burning for air, the desperate struggle against an unstoppable force, it was a nightmare that occasionally surfaced in my subconscious, and I wanted to face it, to dissect it in the controlled environment of virtual reality. The application had a disclaimer, a lengthy legal document that I skimmed through, as most people do. It warned of potential psychological distress, the risk of triggering panic attacks, and even in rare cases, physical reactions due to the intensity of the simulations. There was a section about users with pre-existing heart conditions, advising them to consult a physician before using the app. I was young, relatively healthy, and my heart was usually only racing when I had one too many cups of coffee. I clicked agree without a second thought. The setup was simple enough. The VR headset was top of the line, providing a crystal-clear visual field and incredibly responsive tracking. I also had a pair of haptic gloves that promised to simulate the feeling of resistance and pressure. I decided to do the simulation in my apartment, ensuring I was alone and wouldn't be disturbed. There was a strange sense of anticipation building within me, a mix of fear and excitement that was almost addictive. I selected the drowning simulation from the menu. The app prompted me to choose the environment. There were several options: a deep lake, a raging river, the open ocean, and even a flooded room. I opted for the flooded room, thinking it might feel more claustrophobic, more intense. The simulation began with a slow fade-in. I found myself standing in what looked like an ordinary bedroom. The walls were painted a pale blue. There was a simple wooden dresser and a window showing a cloudy sky. Everything seemed normal, peaceful even. Then, a low gurgling sound began, faint at first but gradually growing louder. I looked down and saw a thin layer of water seeping in from under the door. Panic didn't set in immediately. There was a sense of detached observation, a curiosity about how the simulation would unfold. But as the water level began to rise, inch by agonizing inch, a knot of anxiety started to tighten in my stomach. The gurgling intensified, and I could hear the distinct sound of water sloshing against the furniture. The virtual water felt surprisingly real. I could feel a slight pressure on my ankles as it reached that level. The visual detail was incredible. I could see tiny particles floating in the murky water, the way it distorted the appearance of the objects in the room. As the water climbed, higher, reaching my knees, then my waist, a sense of unease began to morph into genuine fear. The room felt smaller now, the walls closing in, the air was thick with humidity, and the sound of the rising water filled my ears. A constant, suffocating reminder of the impending doom. When the water reached my chest, the panic finally hit. It was a visceral, primal reaction, a desperate urge to escape. I tried to open the door, but it was jammed shut, the pressure of the water on the other side making it impossible to budge. I looked at the window, but it was sealed tight. I was trapped. The water continued to rise, now reaching my neck. I could feel the coldness seeping into my virtual skin, a chilling sensation that sent shivers down my spine. The air felt heavy, difficult to breathe. I could hear my own virtual breaths becoming ragged, desperate. Then, the water engulfed my face. The sensation was overwhelming. The feeling of liquid filling my nostrils, the burning in my throat as I instinctively tried to gasp for air that wasn't there. My virtual lungs screamed in protest, a searing pain that felt terrifyingly real. My hands flailed, grasping at the empty air, trying to find something to hold on to, something to pull myself up. The visual clarity began to fade, replaced by a blurry, distorted world of swirling water. The sounds became muffled, replaced by a high-pitched ringing in my ears. The pressure on my chest intensified, a crushing weight that made it feel like my ribs were about to snap. The panic was all-consuming. Every fiber of my being was screaming for air, for release. I thrashed wildly, my virtual body convulsing in a desperate attempt to escape the watery prison. But there was no escape. The water was everywhere, filling every space, suffocating me from the inside out. Then, the burning sensation began to subside, replaced by a strange numbness. My struggles grew weaker, my movements less frantic. The blurry world started to darken, the high-pitched ringing fading into a chilling silence. It felt like I was floating, drifting into an endless void. And then, nothing. Just a profound, absolute stillness. My heart had stopped. I ripped off the VR headset, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. My vision swam for a moment, and I had to brace myself against my desk to stay upright. My chest ached, and my lungs felt like they had actually been filled with water. After a few minutes, the initial shock began to subside, replaced by a wave of nausea. I stumbled to the bathroom and splashed cold water on my face, trying to ground myself in reality. It had just been a simulation, I told myself. It wasn't real, but the experience had been so vivid, so intensely realistic, that it had left a lingering residue of fear. I could still feel the phantom sensation of water in my lungs, the echo of that desperate struggle for air. Shaking, I walked back to my computer and looked at the application's log. It recorded various physiological data during the simulation, including heart rate, breathing patterns, and skin conductance. My eyes scanned the log, and then I saw it, a time-stamped entry confirming a cardiac event. My heart had actually stopped, albeit briefly within the virtual world. A chill ran down my spine. It was just a glitch, I reasoned, a sensor malfunction. There was no way a VR simulation could actually cause my heart to stop. But a seed of doubt had been planted, a tiny tendril of unease that began to take root in my mind. Despite the terrifying experience, a strange compulsion began to stir within me. I wanted to try it again. Not immediately, of course. I needed time to process what had happened. But the morbid curiosity, the desire to understand the limits of human experience was still there, lurking beneath the surface of my fear. I closed the application, feeling a strange mix of dread and anticipation. What would happen if I went back? Would the cardiac event happen again? Was it just a glitch, or was there something more sinister at play? The chilling stillness I had experienced at the end of the simulation lingered in my memory. A haunting reminder of the thin line between virtual reality and the ultimate reality. I knew, deep down, that this wouldn't be the last time I descended into the abyss. The darkness had called to me, and I, in my morbid fascination, had answered. The memory of the first simulation clung to me like a damp shroud. Even days later, the phantom sensation of water filling my lungs would occasionally resurface, a chilling reminder of the virtual death I had experienced. Sleep offered little respite, often punctuated by fragmented nightmares of murky water and desperate gasps for air. The image of the application's log, starkly confirming that brief cessation of my heartbeat, was burned into my mind. I knew it was just a simulation, a highly realistic one, perhaps too realistic, but ultimately just lines of code and sophisticated technology tricking my senses. The cardiac event was likely a fluke, a momentary surge of adrenaline that my body misinterpreted. That's what I told myself anyway. It was the only way I could rationalize what had happened and try to move on. But the truth was, a part of me, that dark, curious part that I had always harbored, was undeniably intrigued. The experience had been terrifying, yes, but it had also been profound. I had glimpsed the abyss, felt the ultimate loss of control, and emerged, shaken but strangely enlightened. It was like facing your greatest fear and surviving, leaving you with a twisted sense of accomplishment. My friends noticed the change in me. I was quieter, more withdrawn. My usual enthusiasm for social gatherings had waned, replaced by a preoccupation with my own thoughts. They asked if I was okay, if something was bothering me. I just shrugged it off, mumbled something about stress at work, and retreated further into my own world. I couldn't possibly explain to them what I had experienced, the morbid fascination that was slowly consuming me. They wouldn't understand. They would probably think I was crazy. The Abyss application remained on my desktop, its icon a silent invitation to return. For days, I resisted the urge. I tried to distract myself with other things, movies, books, even attempting to rekindle my interest in some of my old hobbies. But nothing held my attention for long. My thoughts kept drifting back to the simulation, to the chilling stillness at the end. Then, one particularly bleak evening, the pull became too strong to resist. The sky outside was a bruised purple, mirroring the unsettling feeling in my gut. I found myself staring at the Abyss icon, my hand hovering over the mouse. It was just one more time, I told myself, just to see if it happens again, just to understand it better. I launched the application. The familiar menu screen appeared, the list of simulations stretching out before me like a catalog of horrors. My eyes were drawn immediately to drowning. This time, I hesitated for a moment before clicking. A wave of apprehension washed over me, a cold premonition of what might happen. But the morbid curiosity won out, as it always seemed to do. I decided to try a different environment this time. Instead of the flooded room, I selected Deep Lake. I imagined the vast expanse of water, the darkness below, the feeling of being completely isolated. It seemed like a different kind of terror, less claustrophobic, but perhaps more profound in its sense of helplessness. The simulation began with a sense of tranquility. I found myself floating on the surface of a dark, still lake. The sky above was a clear, star-dusted expanse. The only sound was the gentle lapping of water against my virtual body. It was almost peaceful, but I knew this wouldn't last. Soon enough, the subtle shift began. A faint current started to pull me downwards, slowly at first, then with increasing force. I tried to paddle, to fight against it, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. My virtual arms flailed uselessly in the water. As I descended deeper, the light from the surface began to fade, replaced by an oppressive darkness. The water grew colder, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into my virtual core. The pressure increased, a subtle squeezing sensation that grew more intense as I sank further. Panic began to set in, a familiar tightening in my chest. I tried to hold my breath, but my virtual lungs were already screaming for air. The urge to inhale was overwhelming, a primal instinct that I couldn't suppress. Then, the inevitable happened. My mouth opened involuntarily, and the icy water rushed in. The burning sensation in my throat and lungs was even more intense this time, a searing agony that made me convulse. The darkness around me swirled, and I could feel myself sinking faster, deeper into the abyss. The struggle was more frantic this time, fueled by the memory of the previous experience. I knew what was coming, the slow fade into nothingness, and I fought against it with every fiber of my virtual being. My hands clawed at the water, trying to find something to grab onto, but there was only the endless, cold expanse. The pressure on my chest became unbearable, and I felt a sharp, stabbing pain in my heart. The blurry, distorted world began to spin, and the high-pitched ringing returned, louder and more insistent than before. I could feel my virtual body shutting down, my struggles becoming weaker, more futile. Then, just like before, the burning subsided, replaced by a strange numbness. The pain in my chest faded, and the frantic thrashing of my limbs slowed to a gentle drift. The darkness deepened, and the ringing faded into that familiar, chilling stillness. Again, my heart had stopped. I ripped off the headset, gasping for breath, my body even more violently shaken than before. This time, the nausea was immediate and intense. I stumbled to the bathroom and vomited, the physical reaction a testament to the sheer terror of the experience. When I finally managed to calm down, I went back to my computer, my hands trembling, as I opened the application log. My eyes scanned the entries, and there it was again, another time-stamped cardiac event, even briefer this time, but undeniably there. The logical part of my brain screamed that this couldn't be happening. It had to be a malfunction, a glitch in the system. But the fear that gnawed at me was growing stronger, whispering doubts that I couldn't ignore. What if it wasn't a glitch? What if the simulation was somehow affecting me in a real, physical way? Despite the overwhelming fear, that morbid curiosity still lingered. The fact that it had happened again, that my heart had actually stopped twice within the virtual world, only deepened the mystery. What was it about this particular simulation that was causing such a drastic physical reaction? Over the next few weeks, I found myself drawn back to the Abyss application again and again. Each time I tried a different environment. The raging river, the open ocean, even the flooded room again, just to see if the environment made a difference. And each time, the experience was the same. The initial tranquility, the slow descent, the overwhelming panic, the burning sensation, the desperate struggle, and then the chilling stillness. And each time, the log confirmed another cardiac event. The duration of the cardiac arrest seemed to vary, sometimes just a fraction of a second, other times a little longer, but it was always there. It was becoming a terrifying pattern. I started to notice other things too, subtle changes in the simulations that I couldn't quite explain. Sometimes during the descent, I would catch fleeting glimpses of something. In the darkness below, a shape, a shadow, something that didn't seem to belong. When I tried to focus on it, it would disappear, leaving me wondering if it was just my imagination. A trick of the light in the virtual water. Other times, I would hear faint sounds, whispers that seemed to come from the depths. They were indistinct, unintelligible, but they sent a shiver of unease down my spine. It was as if something was down there, watching me, waiting for me. The line between the virtual world and reality was beginning to blur. I found myself thinking about the simulations even when I wasn't in them. The feeling of water on my skin, the burning in my lungs, the chilling stillness. They would all come back to me unbidden like phantom sensations. My obsession with the drowning simulation was growing. It was like a dark addiction, a terrifying cycle that I couldn't seem to break. I knew it was dangerous, that I was playing with fire, but the morbid curiosity, the need to understand, kept pulling me back into the abyss. One night, after another harrowing simulation, I noticed something different in the log. Along with the usual cardiac event confirmation, there was a new entry, a single line of text that I hadn't seen before. It simply read, "Subject exhibits signs of prolonged submersion." Prolonged submersion. But the simulations only lasted a few minutes at most. I had always ripped off the headset as soon as my heart stopped. What did that entry mean? A cold dread washed over me. Was the application somehow misinterpreting the data? Or was something else happening, something that I wasn't aware of? I tried to rationalize it, Maybe it was a bug in the software, a random error in the logging system. But the feeling of unease persisted, a nagging suspicion that there was more to this than met the eye. I looked at the abyss icon on my desktop, no longer seeing it as just an invitation, but as a warning. I knew I should stop. I knew I was going down a dangerous path. But the darkness had taken hold, and I felt myself being pulled further and further into its depths with no clear way out. The chilling stillness at the end of each simulation was starting to feel less like a temporary cessation and more like a glimpse into a potential permanent reality. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to stop. The abyss had become my morbid fascination, and I was descending deeper with each simulated breath towards an unknown and terrifying conclusion. The line separating my waking hours from my simulated drownings had become frighteningly thin. I would find myself instinctively holding my breath in the shower, a fleeting panic seizing me as the water ran over my face. The sound of running water, once a mundane part of daily life, now carried an undercurrent of dread. My dreams were a constant replay of my descents into the virtual abyss, each one more vivid and terrifying than the last. Despite the growing fear, the compulsion to return to the abyss application remained. It was like an addiction, a dark craving that I couldn't satisfy. I knew I was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, but the morbid curiosity, the unsettling allure of the unknown, kept pulling me back. One evening, after a particularly draining day at work, I found myself staring at the abyss icon yet again. The thought of another simulation filled me with a familiar mix of dread and anticipation. I knew it was foolish, potentially harmful, but I couldn't resist. I launched the application and selected the deep lake environment, the one that had initially felt the most isolating and profound. As the simulation began, the familiar tranquility settled over me. The dark, still water, the star-dusted sky, it was a deceptive calm before the storm. The downward current started sooner this time, pulling me into the inky depths with an almost eager force. The darkness enveloped me quickly, the cold seeping into my virtual skin. The pressure mounted, a crushing weight that felt almost unbearable from the start. The panic hit sooner too. A visceral wave of terror that washed over me even before the water filled my virtual lungs. I knew what was coming, the burning, the struggle, the stillness. But this time, there was a subtle difference, a feeling of unease that went beyond the usual fear. It felt wrong. The moment the icy water rushed into my mouth and nostrils, the burning sensation was more intense than ever before, as if my virtual lungs were already raw and inflamed. The darkness around me seemed thicker, more oppressive. The high-pitched ringing started almost immediately, a piercing tone that resonated deep within my virtual skull. I thrashed wildly, my virtual body convulsing in a desperate attempt to escape the watery prison. But this time, there was a resistance I hadn't felt before. It was as if the water itself was heavier, thicker, clinging to me, holding me down. My movements felt sluggish, ineffective. And then, I saw it. A flicker of movement in the darkness below. It was just a brief glimpse, a fleeting shadow, but it was undeniably there. It was larger than anything I had seen before, a vaguely humanoid shape that seemed to be moving towards me. My heart pounded in my chest, a real, physical reaction to the terror of the virtual encounter. This wasn't part of the simulation, was it? There were no entities, no creatures in the descriptions. This was a glitch, something unexpected. As the shape drew closer, I could make out more details. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs elongated and spindly. Its skin appeared pale and translucent, almost luminescent in the murky water. And then, I saw its face. It was vaguely human, but distorted, grotesque. Its eyes were large and black, devoid of any discernible pupils, staring at me with an unnerving intensity. Its mouth was stretched into a wide, silent grin, revealing rows of sharp, needle-like teeth. Fear beyond anything I had ever experienced gripped me. This wasn't just a simulation anymore. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. I tried to scream, but only bubbles escaped my virtual lips. I tried to pull away, to swim back to the surface, but the current was too strong, and the creature was getting closer. It reached out a long, skeletal hand and touched my virtual arm. The sensation was chillingly real, a cold, clammy grip that sent shivers down my spine. It felt like death itself had reached out and taken hold of me. The creature began to pull me down, deeper and deeper into the darkness. I struggled with all my might, kicking and flailing, but its grip was surprisingly strong. The pressure intensified and the burning in my lungs became unbearable. The high-pitched ringing intensified, morphing into a cacophony of distorted sounds, whispers, screams, and something else, something guttural and inhuman. The blurry world around me began to flicker and distort, as if the very fabric of the simulation was unraveling. Then, the creature's face came closer, its black eyes boring into mine. I felt a sense of overwhelming dread, a feeling that this was more than just a virtual experience. This was something else, something sinister. And then it spoke. Its voice was a low, raspy whisper that seemed to echo in my mind, bypassing my virtual ears entirely. "You shouldn't have come back," it hissed. "This is our domain now." Our domain? What did it mean? Before I could process the words, the creature's grin widened, and it opened its mouth. I saw a black, gaping void, and then it lunged. I felt a sharp, agonizing pain, as if something had pierced my virtual flesh. The world around me dissolved into a chaotic mess of distorted colors and sounds. The pressure became immense, crushing me from all sides, and then everything went black. But this time there was no chilling stillness. Instead, there was a feeling of being trapped. I could still feel the cold, the pressure, the lingering pain. I could still hear the faint whispers, the guttural sounds. It was as if I was still submerged, still in the darkness, even though the simulation should have ended. Panic surged through me. I tried to rip off the headset, but my hands wouldn't move. They felt heavy, unresponsive. I tried to open my eyes, but they felt glued shut. I tried to speak, to call for help, but no sound came out. I was trapped in the darkness, with the lingering sensations of the simulation and the terrifying whispers echoing in my mind. How long I remained like that, I couldn't tell. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. It felt like an eternity, an endless void of darkness and fear. Then, slowly, gradually, the sensations began to fade. The pressure eased, the cold receded, the pain subsided. The whispers became fainter until they were just a distant echo. Finally, with a gasp, I ripped off the VR headset. I was back in my apartment, sitting in my chair, the headset clutched in my trembling hands. My body was drenched in sweat, my heart pounding erratically in my chest. My vision swam for a moment, and I felt a wave of nausea. It had felt so real. The creature, its touch, its words. It had been more than just a glitch. It had felt like something had crossed over. Something from within the simulation had somehow manifested itself. I looked at my arms, expecting to see some mark, some sign of the creature's touch. But my skin was smooth and unmarked. It had just been the simulation, I told myself. It wasn't real. But the fear lingered, a cold knot of terror in my stomach. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that I had crossed a line. Shaking, I went to my computer and checked the application log. The usual cardiac event was there, time-stamped as always. But there was something else. Something new. Several lines of garbled text, seemingly random characters and symbols, followed the cardiac event entry. It looked like corrupted data, a system error. Then, at the very end, there was one line of text that was clear, chillingly so. It read, "Subject integration initiated." Subject integration. What did that mean? A wave of icy dread washed over me. The creature's words echoed in my mind. This is our domain now. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew it was bad, terribly bad. The simulation was no longer just a game. It was something else, something far more sinister. Looked at the abyss icon on my desktop, my hand hovering over the mouse. The morbid curiosity was gone, replaced by a primal fear. I knew I should uninstall the application, delete it from my system, and never look back. But a strange, unsettling thought crept into my mind. What if I didn't? What if I went back? What would happen then? The darkness had called to me, and I had answered. And now I had a terrifying feeling that I had opened a door that I could never close. The glitch in the simulation wasn't just a random error. It felt like something had been waiting, and I, in my morbid fascination, had finally given it an opening. The chilling stillness at the end of the last simulation had been replaced by something far more terrifying. The feeling that a part of me was still trapped in the abyss, and something from the abyss had found its way out. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time I closed my eyes, I was plunged back into the inky blackness of the deep lake, the gaunt figure with its black eyes and silent grin looming in the distance. The whispers echoed in my mind, no longer faint, but a constant insidious murmur just at the edge of my hearing. The feeling of cold, clammy hands brushing against my skin would jolt me awake in a cold sweat. I would frantically turn on all the lights in my apartment, desperate to banish the darkness and the lingering sensation of the creature's touch. But even in the bright light, the feeling of being watched, of something just out of sight, persisted. I tried to uninstall the Abyss application. I dragged the icon to the recycling bin and emptied it, a small, futile act of defiance against the unseen force that seemed to have taken root in my life. But the next time I turned on my computer, the icon was back, sitting innocently on my desktop as if it had never been moved. A wave of icy dread washed over me. It was as if the application itself was sentient, refusing to be deleted. I tried to talk to my friends, to explain what was happening. But how could I describe the terror of a virtual entity that seemed to be bleeding into reality? They would think I had finally lost my mind. I mumbled vague excuses about stress and lack of sleep, further isolating myself in my growing paranoia. The whispers became clearer, more distinct. They weren't just random murmurs anymore. They were words, but not in any language I recognized. They were guttural, sibilant, like the hissing of snakes mixed with the moans of the dying. And sometimes, just sometimes, I thought I could hear my own name whispered among them. The physical sensations also intensified. I would randomly feel the crushing pressure on my chest, the burning in my lungs, even when I was nowhere near the VR headset. It was as if my body was reliving the drowning experience without the simulation. I started to cough up clear fluid, a thin, watery substance that terrified me. Was my body somehow reacting to the virtual drownings as if they were real? One night, I woke up to find myself standing in the middle of my living room, the VR headset on my head. I had no memory of putting it on. My heart pounded in my chest as I frantically ripped it off. The screen was still displaying the Abyss menu, the drowning simulation highlighted. Had I subconsciously launched it in my sleep? Or was something else at play? I started to experience vivid waking hallucinations. I would catch glimpses of the gaunt figure in the periphery of my vision, its black eyes staring at me from the shadows. Sometimes I would see trails of murky water on my apartment floor, only for them to vanish when I looked directly at them. The line between reality and the terrifying world of abyss was dissolving completely. The log entries in the application started to change too. The cardiac events were still being recorded, but now they were accompanied by increasingly cryptic messages. Vessel weakening. Integration progressing. Resistance futile. The subject integration initiated message from the last simulation haunted my thoughts. What was being integrated? Was it my consciousness merging with something within the application? Was the creature trying to take over my body? One evening, as I sat huddled on my couch, trying to ignore the incessant whispers, I felt an overwhelming urge to put the headset back on. It wasn't my own desire. It felt like an external force, a compulsion that I couldn't resist. My hand reached out, seemingly of its own volition, and picked up the headset. I fought against it, my mind screaming in protest, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if I was a puppet, my strings being pulled by an unseen hand. Slowly, inexorably, I raised the headset to my face and put it on. The familiar darkness of the deep lake enveloped me. But this time, it was different. The water was still, almost viscous, and the darkness was absolute. There were no stars in the sky above, no gentle lapping of waves, just an oppressive, suffocating void. Then I saw it. The gaunt figure was there, right in front of me, its black eyes burning into my soul. But it was different too. It looked familiar. Its features seemed to have subtly shifted, taking on a disturbing resemblance to my own. The silent grin widened, and it raised a long, skeletal hand. This time, instead of touching me, it gestured towards something behind it. I turned and saw a reflection in the dark water. It was me, but not quite. My skin was pale and translucent, my eyes large and black. My mouth stretched into a silent, horrifying grin. The creature turned back to me, its voice now undeniably my own, whispered, "Welcome home, Jessica. You are one of us now." Terror beyond comprehension seized me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to rip off the headset, but my hands were no longer my own. They were long and spindly, just like the creature's. I looked down at my body. It was changing, morphing, becoming more like the entity that stood before me. My skin was losing its color, becoming translucent. My limbs were elongating, growing thin and frail. My eyes felt like they were swelling, becoming large and black. The whispers intensified, surrounding me, enveloping me. They were no longer unintelligible. They were welcoming me, accepting me into their fold. The creature, the other me, reached out and took my hand. Its touch was cold and clammy, but it no longer felt alien. It felt right. We began to sink together, deeper and deeper into the viscous darkness. The pressure mounted, but I no longer felt the burning in my lungs. There was no need for air anymore. As we descended, other figures emerged from the darkness, their gaunt forms and black eyes eerily familiar. They were all like me, or what I was becoming. They reached out, their skeletal hands grasping at me, welcoming me to their domain. The last thing I saw before the darkness consumed me completely was my own reflection in the still, black water. A pale, gaunt figure with black eyes and a silent, horrifying grin, sinking into the abyss, finally home. The Abyss application remains on my computer. It cannot be uninstalled. It waits patiently for the next user, the next soul curious enough to delve into its depths. And when they do, they will find us waiting, ready to welcome them to our domain. The chilling stillness at the end is not an end. It is just the beginning of the integration. And once it starts, there is no escape. You shouldn't have come back. This is our domain now, and soon it will be yours too. My name is Michael, just Michael. No fancy last name that trails off the tongue like a forgotten melody. No quirky middle initial that hints at a hidden lineage. Just plain, ordinary Michael. And for the vast majority of my 30-something years, that's exactly how my life has been, plain and ordinary. I work a standard 9 to 5 in IT support, troubleshooting the digital woes of people who still think turning their computer off and on again is some kind of arcane ritual. I live in a cookie-cutter suburban house in a quiet neighborhood where the most exciting event of the week is usually Mrs. Henderson's prize-winning roses finally blooming. My social life consists mainly of catching up with a couple of friends online after work, playing the same handful of video games we've been playing for years. I'm not complaining, not really. There's a certain comfort in the predictable rhythm of it all. No dramatic highs, sure, but also blessedly few catastrophic lows. Just a steady, unwavering hum of normalcy. Or at least, that's how it was until about a month ago. That's when things started to shift. Subtly at first, like a barely perceptible tremor beneath the surface of the mundane. It started with the app. I can't even remember how I stumbled across it. Probably some late-night half-conscious scrolling through the endless abyss of the App Store. The icon was simple, almost minimalist. A stark black silhouette of a house against a deep crimson background. The name, however, was what really caught my eye. Nightfall. The description was vague, almost cryptic. Experience the ultimate, immersive simulation of fear. That was it. No further explanation, no screenshots, no user reviews to offer any insight. Just that single, tantalizing line. Curiosity, that relentless human itch, got the better of me. It was free, after all. What did I have to lose? The download was quick, almost suspiciously so for something claiming to offer such an intense experience. Once it was installed, the app simply sat there on my phone's home screen, that ominous black house, a constant silent invitation. For a few days I ignored it. It felt unsettling. There was something about the starkness of the icon, the lack of any real information that made me hesitate. It felt like peering into a void, and I wasn't entirely sure I wanted to know what might be staring back. But the curiosity persisted, gnawing at the edges of my mind. Late one evening, after another uneventful day of fixing printer jams and password resets, I found myself idly tapping the icon. The app opened instantly, displaying a single screen. In the center was a button that read, "Begin Simulation." Below it, in small, almost apologetic text, were the words, "Warning, may cause intense emotional distress." I hesitated again. Intense emotional distress? That sounded a bit dramatic for a mobile app. But then again, the cryptic nature of the whole thing was part of its allure. I took a deep breath, a nervous chuckle escaping my lips. "All right," I muttered to myself. "Let's see what all the fuss is about." I tapped the Begin Simulation button. The screen went black for a moment, and then a new interface appeared. It was surprisingly realistic, almost like a security camera feed. The image was grainy, slightly distorted, but undeniably a view of the interior of a house. It looked familiar, too familiar. My heart skipped a beat as I realized with a jolt that the house depicted on the screen was my house. My living room, to be precise. I could see the worn armchair in the corner, the slightly crooked picture frame on the wall, even the coffee table with the stack of magazines I hadn't gotten around to reading yet. A wave of unease washed over me. How was this possible? Was the app somehow accessing my phone's camera and projecting a live feed? That seemed unlikely, given the slightly stylized look of the image. It felt more like a very detailed rendering, but the accuracy was unnerving. Below the video feed, there were a few options. A small map of the house layout, a settings menu, and a text box labeled Scenario. I tapped on the scenario box and a list of options popped up. Lost in the woods, abandoned hospital, subway station at night, and home invasion. My blood ran cold. That was specific. Too specific. A shiver traced its way down my spine. This wasn't just some generic horror app. There was something else going on here. I briefly considered closing the app, deleting it then and there, but the morbid curiosity had taken hold, its grip tightening with each passing second. I had to know what this was. I had to see what happened. Against my better judgment, I selected Home Invasion. The video feed on the screen remained the same, showing my empty living room. Below it, a new text appeared. The simulation will begin in 60 seconds. Please ensure you are in a quiet and comfortable environment for the optimal experience. 60 seconds. That felt like an eternity. My palms started to sweat, and my breath hitched in my throat. What was I about to experience? Was this just some elaborate soundscape designed to trick my mind into thinking someone was in the house? Or was it something more sinister? I looked around my own living room, suddenly seeing it in a new light. The familiar furniture seemed to cast longer, more menacing shadows in the dim light of the evening. The silence of the house, which usually brought me comfort, now felt heavy, pregnant with unspoken threats. The countdown on the screen ticked down relentlessly. 50, 45, 40. I stood up, pacing nervously around the room. I had to get a grip. This was just an app, a simulation. It couldn't actually hurt me. Could it? 30, 25, 20. I glanced at the front door, suddenly hyper-aware of its flimsy lock. What if someone was trying to get in? The thought sent a jolt of genuine fear through me, a fear that had nothing to do with the app. Fit 10, 5. The countdown reached 0. The video feed on the screen flickered, and then the perspective shifted. Instead of the static view of the living room, I was now seeing the scene through what felt like my own eyes. I was standing in the hallway just outside the living room. The lighting was dim, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. A low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere in the darkness ahead. My heart pounded in my chest. This was incredibly immersive. The visual detail was stunning, almost photorealistic. And the sound, it felt like it was coming from all around me, not just from my phone's speakers. I took a tentative step forward, my virtual feet padding softly on the virtual carpet. The growling sound grew louder, closer. I could feel a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. Suddenly, a shadow flickered at the end of the hallway. A tall, gaunt figure emerged from the darkness, its features obscured by the gloom. But there was something about its posture, the way it moved, that sent a primal wave of terror through me. I wanted to scream, to turn and run, but my virtual body felt frozen in place. The figure took another step closer, and I could make out a pair of glowing red eyes staring directly at me. This wasn't just a simulation. This felt real. Too real. The figure raised a hand, and I saw a glint of metal in the dim light, a knife, a long, wickedly sharp knife. My breath hitched in my throat. This was it. This was how it ended. The figure lunged. I flinched, squeezing, my eyes shut. I felt a sharp, searing pain in my chest, followed by a wet, gurgling sound. My virtual legs buckled beneath me, and I collapsed to the floor. The last thing I saw, before the darkness consumed me, was the figure standing over me, its red eyes burning into my soul. Then, nothing. Absolute, all-encompassing darkness. And then, the cessation. The sudden jarring end to the sensory input. It was like being yanked back from the brink of oblivion. I gasped, my eyes snapping open. I was sitting at my kitchen table, the remnants of my dinner still on the plate in front of me. The television was playing softly in the background, its blue light casting long shadows across the room. My heart was pounding in my chest, my skin clammy with sweat. I looked down at my hands, expecting to see blood, but they were clean. I touched my chest, feeling for a wound, but there was nothing there. It had all been a simulation. Just an app. But the fear, the terror, it had felt so real. The image of those red eyes, the cold glint of the knife. It was burned into my memory. I reached for my phone, my hand trembling slightly. The Nightfall app was still open. On the screen, the words "Simulation ended" displayed in stark white letters. I stared at the app for a long moment, a profound sense of unease settling over me. It was just a game, I told myself. A very realistic game, but nothing more. But a nagging doubt lingered in the back of my mind. The level of detail, the way it had felt, it was beyond anything I had ever experienced in a game before. I closed the app and tossed my phone onto the table. I needed to clear my head. I stood up and walked into the living room, the same living room I had just seen in the simulation. Everything was as it should be. The armchair in the corner, the crooked picture frame, the stack of magazines on the coffee table. It was all exactly the same. But somehow, it didn't feel the same. The familiar comfort of my home had been tainted, replaced by a sense of vulnerability, a feeling that something was lurking just out of sight. I couldn't shake the image of that figure in the hallway, those glowing red eyes staring at me. It felt like more than just a figment of my imagination. It felt like a memory, a real, visceral memory of something that had actually happened. I went to bed later that night, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I kept thinking about the app, about the home invasion scenario. What if it wasn't just a simulation? What if it was some kind of premonition? The thought sent a shiver down my spine. I knew it was irrational, ridiculous even, but the feeling persisted, a cold knot of dread in the pit of my stomach. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me and I drifted off to sleep. But my dreams were troubled, filled with shadows and the chilling image of glowing red eyes. I woke up the next morning feeling groggy and unsettled. The events of the previous night felt strangely distant, like a half-forgotten nightmare. But the unease remained, a subtle undercurrent of anxiety that I couldn't quite shake. I went through my morning routine, trying to act normal, to pretend that everything was fine. But the thought of the app lingered in the back of my mind, a dark seed that had been planted and was now slowly beginning to sprout. As I was getting ready for work, I glanced at my phone lying on the nightstand. The black icon of the Nightfall app seemed to pulse faintly, a silent invitation to return to the darkness. I hesitated for a moment, my fingers hovering over the screen. Should I delete it? Should I pretend it never happened? But the curiosity, that same relentless itch that had led me to download the app in the first place, was back. It was whispering in my ear, telling me that I needed to know more, that I needed to understand what I had experienced. With a sigh of resignation, I picked up my phone and tapped the icon. The app opened, displaying the familiar interface. The Begin Simulation button was there, waiting. I stared at it for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew this was a bad idea. I knew I should just delete the app and move on with my life. But something held me back. A strange sense of compulsion, a feeling that I was being drawn into something I didn't fully understand. Against my better judgment, I tapped the Begin Simulation button again. This time, the screen didn't go black. Instead, a new message appeared. "Welcome back, Michael." My blood ran cold. How did it know my name? I hadn't entered any personal information when I downloaded the app. Below the welcome message, a new option had appeared. Continue last simulation. My hand trembled as I reached out and tapped the button. The screen flickered, and then I was back in the hallway, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. The air was thick with the same sense of foreboding I had felt before. But this time, there was no growling sound, just silence, an unnerving, heavy silence. I took a tentative step forward, my virtual heart pounding in my chest. The hallway stretched out before me, leading deeper into the virtual house. I knew I should turn back, close the app, and forget about all of this, but I couldn't. Something was compelling me to continue, to see what lay ahead. As I moved further down the hallway, I noticed something different: the house. It wasn't quite the same as before. The layout was similar, but the details were different. The furniture was arranged differently, the pictures on the walls were unfamiliar. This wasn't my house anymore. A wave of panic washed over me. Where was I? What was happening? I tried to turn back, to run, but my virtual legs felt heavy, unresponsive. It was like trying to move through thick mud. Suddenly, a door at the end of the hallway creaked open. A sliver of light spilled out into the darkness, illuminating a figure standing in the doorway. It was the same figure I had seen before, the tall, gaunt silhouette with the glowing red eyes. But this time, I could see its features more clearly. Its face was pale and gaunt, its skin stretched taut over sharp, angular bones. Its eyes glowed with an unnatural red light, burning into me with malevolent intensity. It raised its hand, and I saw the knife again, its blade glinting in the dim light. This time, I didn't close my eyes. I stared at the figure, my heart pounding. In my chest, a silent scream trapped in my throat. It took a step closer, and I could feel its cold, dead gaze fixed on me. "Hello, Michael," it whispered, its voice a raspy, chilling sound that seemed to echo in the virtual space. My blood ran cold. How did it know my name? It raised the knife, its red eyes never leaving mine. "It's time to finish what we started," it said, a cruel smile twisting its lips, and then it lunged. This time I didn't just feel the pain. I saw the knife plunging into my chest, the blood blooming around the wound like a dark flower. I felt the life draining out of me, the cold embrace of death closing in. The darkness that followed was absolute. And then, the familiar cessation. My heart stopped. I sat up in a cold sweat, the app a malevolent presence on my phone. This time, I wasn't in my kitchen. I wasn't in my bed. I was lying on the floor of my hallway, the dim light casting long shadows on the walls. The air was cold, heavy with a sense of dread, and standing over me, its red eyes burning into my soul, was the figure from the app. It smiled, a slow, chilling smile. "Welcome," it whispered. "Welcome to nightfall." My mind reeled, struggling to reconcile the impossible reality unfolding before my eyes. One moment I was in the stark blackness of the simulation's end, the next I was here, on the cold, hard floor of my hallway, staring up at the very entity that had just killed me in the app. It was real, undeniably, terrifyingly real. The gaunt face, the sharp, skeletal features, the skin stretched so thin it looked translucent. All the details I had perceived in the virtual world were now rendered in chilling clarity. And those eyes, those burning, malevolent red eyes, they held an intelligence, a predatory hunger that sent a primal shiver down my spine, even as I lay paralyzed with fear. "Welcome," it had whispered, the raspy voice sending icy tendrils of dread coiling in my gut. "Welcome to nightfall." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Nightfall. The name of the app. Was this some kind of twisted joke? A nightmarish prank taken to an unimaginable extreme? My body finally started to respond, jolting with a surge of adrenaline. I scrambled backwards, pushing myself away from the creature, my hands slipping on the cold tile floor. My breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale a painful reminder of the phantom wound in my chest. The entity didn't move, didn't even seem to react to my frantic attempts to escape. It simply stood there, its gaze unwavering, that cruel smile still etched on its lips. It was as if my fear was a delicious appetizer and my struggle only heightened its anticipation. "What are you?" I stammered, my voice barely a whisper. The words felt weak, pathetic, against the sheer terror that gripped me. The entity tilted its head slightly, its red eyes glinting in the dim light filtering from the living room. "I am what you invited in, Michael." Invited in? The app, the simulation, had it somehow opened a door to this? My mind struggled to grasp the concept, to find any logical explanation for what was happening. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be real. The app, it was just a game. I choked out, desperately clinging to the remnants of my sanity. The entity let out a soft, chilling chuckle, a sound that scraped against my nerves like fingernails on a chalkboard. A game. Oh, Michael. It was so much more than a game. It was a key, a gateway. Its gaze swept around the hallway as if admiring its new surroundings. You see, fear is a powerful thing. It resonates. It creates openings. And you, Michael, you were so eager to experience it, so willing to immerse yourself. You opened the door wider than you could ever imagine. My blood ran cold. Was it true? Had my morbid curiosity, my desire for a thrill, somehow unleashed this thing into my world? The thought was horrifying, a crushing weight of guilt adding to the already overwhelming terror. The entity took a slow, deliberate step closer. I recoiled, pressing myself back against the wall, my eyes darting around frantically, searching for any means of escape. The front door was just a few feet away, but the entity stood between me and it, a silent, insurmountable barrier. "Don't try to run, Michael," it said, its voice dangerously soft. "It would be, impolite after I've just arrived." Its gaze dropped to my chest and I instinctively flinched, the phantom pain from the simulation flaring up again. "You felt that, didn't you?" it said, its smile widening. The final, brutal blow. It felt so real, because in a way, it was. It reached out a long skeletal finger and traced an invisible line across my chest. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I could almost feel the cold steel of the knife piercing my flesh. The app. "It showed you a possibility, Michael," the entity continued. "A glimpse of what could be. And now that possibility is here." My mind raced, trying to make sense of its words. A possibility? Was this some kind of supernatural being that fed on fear, that manifested through the power of suggestion and the user's own terror? "Why me?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. "Why my house?" The entity chuckled again, a dry, rattling sound. "Why not you, Michael? You were the one who downloaded the app. You were the one who chose the home invasion scenario. You invited me in, remember?" Its words were like a twisted echo of my own thoughts from the previous night. The realization that I was responsible for this, at least in some way, was almost as terrifying as the creature itself. It took another step closer, and I could smell it now. A cloying, sickly sweet odor that made my stomach churn. It smelled of decay and something else, something ancient and indescribably foul. "What do you want?" I pleaded, tears welling up in my eyes. Just leave me alone." The entity stopped, its head tilting again, as if considering my words. "Leave you alone? But Michael, we've only just met, and we have so much to experience together. Its red eyes seemed to glow brighter, and I felt a cold dread seep into my very bones. This wasn't just about fear anymore. There was a malevolence here, a sadistic pleasure in my terror that was far more disturbing. Suddenly the lights flickered, plunging the hallway into momentary darkness before sputtering back to life. The entity didn't seem affected, its red eyes still burning in the dim light. But the brief darkness had given me a sliver of hope, a fleeting thought of escape. I lunged to my feet, ignoring the shooting pain in my chest, and made a desperate dash for the front door. My hand fumbled with the doorknob, my fingers slick with sweat. I twisted it frantically, pulling the door open and stumbling out onto the porch. The night air was cold against my skin, but it felt like a breath of fresh air compared to the suffocating presence of the entity. I didn't stop to look back, didn't dare to see if it was following me. I just ran, my bare feet pounding on the pavement, my lungs burning with the effort. I ran blindly, not knowing where I was going, just wanting to put as much distance as possible between myself and that thing. The quiet suburban streets, usually so peaceful, now seemed menacing, the shadows stretching like grasping claws. I could hear my own ragged breathing, the frantic pounding of my heart in my ears. I risked a quick glance over my shoulder, but the porch was empty. Had I actually escaped? Was it not going to follow me? Hope flickered within me, a fragile ember in the darkness of my fear. Maybe it was confined to the house. Maybe crossing the threshold had broken its connection. I kept running, my legs aching, my lungs screaming for air. Finally, I spotted a streetlight in the distance and veered towards it, hoping to find some sign of life, some indication that I wasn't completely alone in this nightmare. As I reached the streetlight, I leaned against the pole, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. I looked back at my house, a dark silhouette against the night sky. Everything seemed normal, peaceful. There was no sign of the entity, no indication of the terror that had just unfolded within its walls. Was it all just a hallucination? A vivid nightmare brought on by the app? The thought was tempting, a desperate attempt to cling to some semblance of sanity. But the cold dread in my gut, the lingering smell of decay in my nostrils, the phantom pain in my chest, they all told a different story. This was real. This had happened. I needed help. I needed to call the police, to tell someone what I had seen. But what would I say? Officer, there's a demonic entity in my house that came from a horror app I downloaded. They'd lock me up in a psych ward before I could even finish the sentence. I pulled out my phone, my hand still shaking. The screen flickered to life, displaying the time, 3:17 a.m. A shiver ran down my spine, down. The witching hour. Perfect. My eyes fell on the Nightfall app icon, still sitting innocently on my home screen. A surge of anger, mixed with a healthy dose of terror, coursed through me. This was all its fault. This malevolent piece of software had unleashed this horror into my life. I tapped the icon, my finger hovering over the uninstall button. But something stopped me. A morbid curiosity, that same insidious urge that had gotten me into this mess in the first place. I had to know more. I had to understand what this app was, where it came from, and how to stop it. Instead of uninstalling it, I tapped the icon to open it. The familiar interface appeared, the Begin Simulation button still prominent. But something was different. Below it, where the Continue Last Simulation button had been, there was a new option. Reality mode. My heart skipped a beat. Reality mode. What did that even mean? Was the app somehow aware of what had happened? Was it acknowledging the shift from simulation to this? Against every fiber of my being, I tapped the reality mode button. The screen went black for a moment, and then a new interface appeared. It looked different from the simulation mode. There was no video feed, no map. Instead, there was a text-based interface like an old-school command prompt. A single line of text read, "Location, Michael's residence." Below it, a blinking cursor waited for input. My mind raced. What was this? How was I supposed to interact with it? I hesitantly typed, "Who are you?" I pressed enter, and after a brief pause, a response appeared on the screen. "I am the architect of your fear." My breath caught in my throat. The architect of my fear. Was this the entity itself, or something else entirely? I typed another question. "What do you want?" The response came almost instantly. "I want what you offered. Immersion. Belief. A willing participant in the theater of terror." Theater of terror. Was that all this was to it? Some kind of twisted game played out in the real world? I typed, "How do I stop you?" The cursor blinked for a long moment and then the response appeared. "You don't. You invited me in, Michael. Now the show must go on." A cold wave of despair washed over me. I was trapped. There was no escape. Suddenly my phone vibrated in my hand. A new message had appeared on the screen, overlaid on the app interface. It was a text message, but it wasn't from anyone I knew. The message read, "Look behind you, Michael." My blood ran cold. I slowly turned around, my heart pounding in my chest. The streetlight cast long, distorted shadows, making it hard to see clearly. And then I saw it. Standing at the edge of the light, just beyond the reach of its glow, was the entity. Its red eyes burned like embers in the darkness, fixed on me with an unnerving intensity. It hadn't been confined to the house. It had followed me. There was no escape. A wave of pure, unadulterated terror washed over me. I wanted to scream, to run, but my legs felt like lead. I was frozen, caught in its gaze like a rabbit in the headlights. The entity took a slow, deliberate step forward, emerging from the shadows into the light. That cruel smile was back on its face, wider, more menacing than before. "Did you really think you could get away, Michael?" It whispered, its raspy voice seeming to echo in the silent night. "The game has just begun." It raised its hand, and I saw the glint of the knife in the streetlight. This time, I knew there would be no waking up. This was real. This was the end. The last thing I saw before the darkness descended was the entity lunging towards me, its red eyes burning into my soul, the cold steel of the knife aimed directly at my heart. And then, nothing. Just the cold, hard pavement beneath me, the distant hum of the city, and the lingering scent of decay in the air. My heart had stopped, but this time there was no cessation, no jarring return to reality. There was only the cold, the dark, and the chilling whisper that echoed in my mind. "Welcome to nightfall, Michael. Your nightmare has just begun." The cold was absolute. Not just the physical chill of the night air on my skin, but a deeper, more profound cold that seeped into my very being, extinguishing any remaining warmth or life. The darkness that followed the entity's final lunge wasn't the familiar cessation of the app simulation. This was different. This was the void. Yet within that void, there was a sensation, a faint awareness that persisted. It was like being a disembodied consciousness, adrift in an endless sea of black. I could sense nothing, hear nothing, feel nothing in the traditional sense. But there was a presence, a pervasive feeling of being watched, of being observed. Then, slowly, fragments of sensation began to return. A dull ache, like a persistent throb, emanated from my chest. The feeling of the cold pavement pressing against my back. The faint rhythmic sound of breathing. No, not my own. It was too close, too heavy. My eyelids felt impossibly heavy, but I forced them open. The world swam into focus, blurry and indistinct at first. The streetlight above me cast a sickly yellow glow, illuminating the cracked asphalt and the dark shapes of parked cars lining the street. And then I saw it. Standing over me, its gaunt face illuminated by the streetlight, was the entity. Its red eyes glowed with a malevolent satisfaction, and that cruel smile stretched across its lips. The knife, still stained with what looked like my blood, was held loosely in its hand. I tried to speak, to cry out, but no sound escaped my lips. My body felt heavy, unresponsive, as if it no longer belonged to me. "Did you really think it would be that easy, Michael?" The entity whispered, its voice a low, mocking tone. "Death is just another act in our little play." It knelt down, beside me, its red eyes boring into mine. "You are now in my world, Michael. The lines between the simulation and reality have blurred, haven't they? That's the beauty of Nightfall. It doesn't just show you fear, it makes you live it." It reached out a cold skeletal hand and touched my forehead. A jolt of icy energy surged through me, and fragmented images flashed through my mind. The black silhouette of the house on my phone screen, the grainy video feed of my living room, the shadowy figure in the hallway, the glint of the knife. "You remember it all, don't you?" the entity said, its voice almost a purr. "Every terrifying detail. And now you get to experience it again, and again, and again." A wave of despair washed over me. Was this my fate? To be trapped in an endless loop of terror orchestrated by this nightmarish being? The entity stood up, pulling me up with surprising strength. My legs felt like jelly, barely able to support my weight. "Come now, Michael," it said, its grip firm on my arm. "The night is young and the theater awaits." It began to lead me down the street, away from my house, its red eyes scanning the surroundings as if searching for an audience. I tried to resist, to pull away, but its grip was like iron. I was powerless. As we walked, the familiar suburban landscape seemed to warp and distort around us. The houses looked darker, more menacing, their windows like vacant eyes staring into the void. The shadows stretched and writhed, taking on grotesque shapes. The air grew heavy with that sickly, sweet odor, the scent of decay and something ancient. "Where are you taking me?" I finally managed to croak out, my voice hoarse and weak. The entity chuckled. "To the next scene, of course. Every night is a new performance, Michael. And you, my dear participant, will play the starring role." We turned a corner, and I saw that we were no longer on my street. The houses were different, older, their architecture hinting at a forgotten era. The streetlights flickered erratically, casting an eerie, strobe-like effect. A thick fog began to roll in, swirling around. Our feet like ghostly tendrils. "What is this place?" I asked, my fear growing with each step. "This is Nightfall, Michael," the entity replied, its voice echoing in the fog. "A place where fear takes shape, where nightmares become reality, and you are now a permanent resident." The fog grew, thicker, obscuring everything around us. I could barely see the entity's gaunt face in the swirling mist. The air grew colder, and I felt a sense of utter isolation, as if we were the only two beings in this desolate, terrifying world. Suddenly, I heard a sound. A faint rhythmic scraping sound coming from somewhere in the fog ahead. It grew louder, closer, until a figure emerged from the mist. It was a woman, her face pale and contorted in a silent scream. Her eyes were wide with terror, and her hands were outstretched as if pleading for help. But her body was translucent, flickering in and out of existence like a faulty hologram. "Who is that?" I whispered, my heart pounding in my chest. "Ah, that's Sarah," the entity said, its voice nonchalant. "She played her part a few weeks ago, a lovely performance involving a locked basement and, well, you'll see soon enough." My blood ran cold. Was this what awaited me? To become a ghostly figure trapped in this nightmarish realm, reliving my terror for eternity. The translucent woman reached out a spectral hand towards me, her silent scream intensifying. I recoiled, a wave of nausea washing over me. "Don't worry, she can't touch you," the entity said, its grip tightening on my arm. "Not yet, anyway. But you'll have plenty of time to get acquainted." It led me past the woman, who faded back into the fog, her silent scream lingering in the air. The scraping sound continued, growing louder. We emerged from the thickest part of the fog, and I saw the source of the sound. It was a figure hunched over in the middle of the street, its back to us. It appeared to be dragging something heavy along the ground. As we got closer, I could make out what it was dragging. A body, a lifeless, mangled body. My stomach lurched, and I had to fight back the urge to vomit. The body was horribly disfigured, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles, its face a mask of terror and pain. That's David," the entity said, its voice almost cheerful. "He had a particular fondness for the abandoned hospital scenario, a real screamer, that one." It gestured towards the body with the knife. "He's still part of the ambiance. You see, adds a certain authenticity to the experience." I couldn't tear my eyes away from the gruesome sight. Was this the fate of everyone who downloaded the app? To be dragged into this horrifying reality, their fears made manifest, their suffering an eternal spectacle. The entity pulled me onwards past the mangled corpse. The scraping sound faded behind us, replaced by a new sound, the faint, distant wail of a siren. Our next scene is approaching," the entity said, a hint of excitement in its voice. "A classic, this one. The police chase gone wrong scenario. Always a crowd pleaser." As we walked, the sounds of the city grew louder. I could hear the screech of tires, the blare of horns, the frantic shouts of people. The fog began to dissipate, and I saw that we were now in a dimly lit alleyway, the brick walls covered in graffiti. Suddenly, a police car screeched to a halt. At the entrance of the alley, its blue and red lights flashing. Two officers jumped out, their guns drawn. "Freeze, police!" one of them shouted, pointing his weapon directly at me. My mind raced. This was my chance. Maybe I could convince them that something was wrong, that this entity was a threat. "Help! Me!" I cried out, trying to pull away from the entity. "This thing, it's not real." The officers didn't seem to hear me. Their attention was fixed on the entity, which stood beside me, its cruel smile unwavering. "Step away from him!" the other officer yelled at the entity. "Put your hands where we can see them!" The entity simply chuckled, its red eyes glinting in the flashing lights of the police car. "Oh, they can't see me, Michael," it whispered in my ear. "Not really. They only see what I want them to see." It tightened its grip on my arm, pulling me forward. The officers opened fire, flinched as the sound of gunshots echoed in the alley. I felt a sharp pain in my side, and a warm, sticky liquid began to seep through my shirt. The entity didn't even flinch. It simply continued to walk, dragging me along with it. The officers kept firing, but the bullets seemed to pass right through the entity, leaving it unharmed. I looked back and saw the officers staring in disbelief as we walked away, their bullets seemingly having no effect. One of them finally lowered his weapon, shaking his head in confusion. "See, Michael," the entity said, its voice smug. "I told you. This is my world now. And in my world, the rules are different." We emerged from the alleyway onto a busy street. People were walking by, seemingly oblivious to the supernatural horror unfolding right beside them. They didn't see the entity. They didn't see my wound. They just saw a man being dragged along by nothing. The pain in my side was getting worse, and I felt a wave of dizziness wash over me. My vision started to blur, and my legs felt like they were about to give out. I can't," I stammered, my voice barely audible. The entity stopped and looked down at me, its red eyes filled with a cruel amusement. Tired already, Michael? The night has barely begun. We still have so many scenarios to explore. It leaned down, its gaunt face inches from mine. Tonight, I think we'll revisit your favorite, the home invasion. But this time, Michael, you won't be watching from the safety of your phone. You'll be reliving it from the beginning. And this time, there will be no cessation. My heart pounded in my chest, a frantic drumbeat against the encroaching darkness. The pain in my side intensified, and I felt a cold dread grip me. The entity tightened its grip on my arm and began to lead me back in the direction of my house. The familiar streets now seemed alien and menacing, the shadows alive with unseen horrors. As we walked, I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind us. Slow, deliberate footsteps, creeping closer. My terror intensified. Was there another entity? Another victim trapped in this nightmarish realm? The entity beside me seemed to sense my fear. "Ah, that would be Sarah," it said, its voice almost cheerful. "She enjoys tagging along. Keeps things interesting." The footsteps grew closer, and I could almost feel the presence of the translucent woman behind me, her silent scream echoing in my mind. We reached my house, its dark silhouette looming against the night sky. The entity led me up the porch steps and opened the front door. The interior of my house was different now. It was darker, colder, more menacing. The familiar furniture seemed to cast longer, more distorted shadows. The air was thick with the smell of decay. "Welcome home, Michael," the entity whispered, pushing me inside. "Let the performance begin." The front door slammed shut behind us, plunging the house into darkness. I could hear the entity's heavy breathing beside me, the faint scraping sound of Sarah's spectral presence behind me. And then I heard another sound, a slow, deliberate creaking sound coming from upstairs. Footsteps, creeping closer. My terror reached a fever pitch. I was trapped. Trapped in my own home, with a malevolent entity and a ghostly spectator, about to relive my worst nightmare. The footsteps grew louder, closer, the creaking of the floorboard sending shivers down my spine. I could feel the entity's red eyes burning into me in the darkness, and then a voice, raspy and chilling, echoed from the top of the stairs. "Hello, Michael. Did you miss me?" The voice from the top of the stairs sent a fresh wave of icy dread crashing over me. It was the same raspy whisper I had heard in the initial simulation, the voice of the unseen assailant, now somehow amplified, more menacing, in the oppressive darkness of my corrupted home. The entity beside me chuckled, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the stagnant air. "Ah, our star has arrived," it said, its red eyes gleaming in the gloom, adjusting to the near-total darkness far better than my own. "Michael, allow me to introduce you to yourself." My blood ran cold. Myself? What did it mean? Slowly, a figure began to descend the stairs. It was shrouded in shadow at first, but as it moved into the faint light filtering from the street, through the grimy windows, I could make out its form. It was tall and gaunt, its movements slow and deliberate. And then, as it stepped fully into the light, I saw its face. It was me, or rather, a twisted, nightmarish version of me. My features were gaunt and pale, my eyes hollow and black, save for the same malevolent red glow that emanated from the entity beside me. A cruel, predatory smile stretched across its lips, revealing rows of sharp, pointed teeth. The doppelganger reached the bottom of the stairs and turned its gaze towards me. Its red eyes locked onto mine, and I felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated terror. It was like looking into a distorted mirror, a reflection of my deepest fears and darkest potential. "Welcome back, Michael," the doppelganger said, its voice a chilling echo of my own, yet somehow twisted and sinister. "We've been waiting for you." The entity beside me placed a skeletal hand on my shoulder, its grip tightening. You see, Michael, Nightfall doesn't just pull you into a pre-written story. It crafts a personalized nightmare tailored to your deepest anxieties. And what's more terrifying than facing yourself, your own potential for darkness? I tried to speak, but my throat was constricted with fear. I could only stare in horror at the monstrous reflection of myself that stood before me. The doppelganger took a step closer, its red eyes never leaving mine. You thought you could escape, Michael? You thought you could just uninstall the app and go back to your ordinary life? There's no escape from Nightfall. Once you open the door, you're ours. It raised a hand, and I saw a familiar glint of metal in the dim light. The knife. My knife. The one I kept in the kitchen drawer for... well, I couldn't even remember why anymore. The simulation was just a taste, Michael, the doppelganger said, its smile widening. Now it's time for the main course. The entity beside me released my shoulder, stepping back as if to give the doppelganger space. Sarah's spectral presence seemed to drift closer, her silent scream a palpable wave of despair washing over me. I was trapped, cornered in my own living room by two nightmarish entities, one a physical manifestation of my own terror, the other a silent, spectral witness to my impending doom. The doppelganger lunged. This time I didn't flinch. I couldn't. I was frozen in place, my mind reeling, my body numb with fear. I saw the knife flash in the darkness, felt the sharp, searing pain as it plunged into my chest, exactly as it had in the simulation. But this time, there was no cessation. The pain was real, agonizing. I could feel the warmth of my own blood, spreading through my shirt, the life draining out of me. I looked down and saw the knife hilt deep in my chest, the doppelganger's red eyes burning into mine with a triumphant glee. The entity beside it watched with a detached amusement, like a director pleased with the unfolding scene. My legs buckled beneath me and I collapsed to the floor, the cold, hard wood pressing against my back. My vision started to blur, the faces of the two entities above me becoming indistinct shapes in the encroaching darkness. The last thing I saw was the doppelganger leaning down, its twisted face inches from mine, its raspy voice whispering in my ear. "Welcome to the endless night, Michael. Your performance has just begun." And then the darkness consumed me. But this time, it wasn't the familiar blackness of the simulation's end. It was a deeper, more profound darkness. The darkness of oblivion, or so I thought. Slowly, faintly, a new sensation began to emerge from the void, a dull throbbing in my head, the feeling of something cold and smooth beneath my cheek, the faint sound of beeping. My eyelids fluttered open. The world swam into focus, blurry and indistinct at first. I was lying on my back, staring up at a white ceiling. The air was sterile, filled with the faint smell of antiseptic. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy and weak. I looked around and saw that I was in a hospital room. There were machines beside my bed, their screens displaying blinking lights and numbers. A tube ran from my arm into a bag hanging on a pole. A wave of confusion washed over me. What had happened? Was the whole thing just a dream, a terrible, vivid nightmare? Then, the memories came flooding back. The app, the simulation, the entity, the doppelganger, the knife, the pain. It had felt so real. Too real to be just a dream. A nurse entered the room, her face kind and concerned. "Oh, you're awake," she said, her voice gentle. "How are you feeling?" I tried to speak, but my voice was hoarse and weak. What happened?" I managed to croak out. "You were found unconscious on the street last night," she explained. "Someone called an ambulance. You had a stab wound to the chest. You were very lucky." A stab wound? It hadn't been a dream. It had really happened. But how? "Do you remember anything?" the nurse asked. I hesitated. What could I tell her? That I had been attacked by a demonic entity that came out of a horror app. She'd think I was crazy. I don't remember. I lied, my voice still weak. "It's all a blur." The nurse nodded understandingly. "That's common after a trauma like this. Just try to rest. The doctor will be in to see you soon." She adjusted the blankets around me and left the room. I was alone again, my thoughts racing. I had survived, but what about the entity? What about the app? I reached for my phone on the bedside table. It was still there. I picked it up, my hand trembling slightly. The screen flickered to life, displaying the familiar home screen. My eyes were drawn to the black icon of the Nightfall app. It was still there, just as it had been before. A chill ran down my spine. Had it all been real? Or was my mind playing tricks on me? I hesitated for a long moment, my finger hovering over the icon. Should I delete it? Should I try to forget everything that had happened? But the morbid curiosity, the same insidious urge that had led me down this dark path, was still there. I had to know. I had to understand. Against my better judgment, I tapped the icon. The app opened, displaying the familiar interface, the Begin Simulation button, the Reality Mode button, and a new button that hadn't been there before. Continue Endless Night. My blood ran cold. Endless Night? What did that mean? I stared at the button, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I shouldn't press it. I knew I should delete the app and run as far away as possible. But something held me back. A sense of morbid fascination, a terrifying curiosity to see what lay beyond that ominous button. With a deep, shuddering breath, I reached out and tapped, Continue Endless Night. The screen went black for a moment, and then a single line of text appeared. Welcome back, Michael. The performance continues, and then the familiar cessation. My heart stopped. I sat up in a cold sweat, the app a malevolent presence on my phone. I was back in my bed, the familiar surroundings of my bedroom, a stark contrast to the sterile white walls of the hospital. But something was different. A subtle shift in the atmosphere, a pervasive feeling of being watched. The air felt colder, heavier. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to writhe and shift. I looked down at my chest. There was no wound, no blood, just my normal pajamas. But the memory of the knife, the pain, the chilling whisper of the doppelganger, it was all still there, vivid and terrifying. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that I was no longer in control. The app, the entity, the endless night. They had become a part of me. And there was no escape. I looked at my phone, the Nightfall app still open on the screen. The black silhouette of the house seemed to pulse faintly, a silent invitation to return to the darkness, and I knew with a growing sense of dread that I would, again and again. For the endless night had truly begun, and my performance, my terrifying, endless performance, was far from over. The line between reality and the nightmare had been irrevocably blurred, and I was forever trapped in the theater of terror that was Nightfall. The cessation was immediate, yet the lingering chill remained. My heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the silence of my bedroom. The familiar darkness of my room was both a comfort and a terrifying reminder of where I had just been. The app, that malevolent black icon on my phone, pulsed with an unseen energy on my nightstand. The hospital, the stab wound, the brief flicker of hope. It had all been a cruel illusion, a temporary reprieve before being dragged back into the endless night of Nightfall. I was a puppet now, my strings pulled by unseen, malevolent hands. I looked down at my chest, half expecting to see the bloodstain, the gaping wound, but there was nothing. Just the fabric of my pajamas undisturbed, yet the phantom pain lingered. A constant, dull ache that served as a chilling reminder of the reality I had just experienced. The air in my room felt heavy, charged with a palpable sense of dread. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more alive. Every creak of the house, every rustle of leaves outside my window sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I was no longer safe in my own home. It had become a stage, a theater for my personal torment. I reached for my phone, my hand trembling uncontrollably. The screen illuminated, the Nightfall app staring back at me. The Continue Endless Night button glowed ominously. I knew what awaited me if I pressed it. More terror, more pain, more of that chillingly real fear that threatened to shatter my sanity. But a strange compulsion held me captive. It wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was a morbid acceptance, a horrifying understanding that I was trapped in this cycle with no hope of escape. The app had become an extension of myself, a dark mirror reflecting my deepest fears. With a sigh that felt like the last breath of a dying man, I tapped the button. The screen flickered, and the familiar text appeared. "Welcome back, Michael. The performance continues." This time, there was no immediate transition. The darkness of my bedroom remained, but the atmosphere shifted. The air grew colder, the shadows deepened, and a faint, raspy whisper seemed to slither into my ears. "Did you think you could rest, Michael?" I whipped my head around, searching for the source of the voice. The room was empty, save for the familiar shapes of my furniture shrouded in shadow. But the voice, it was undeniably there, inside my head, around me everywhere. "We have so many scenes left to play," the whisper continued, laced with a chilling amusement. "The home invasion, the abandoned hospital, the subway station at night, and so many new ones we've crafted just for you." I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to block out the voice, the encroaching terror. But it was no use. It was inside. Me now, a constant, insidious presence. Slowly, the darkness in my room began to coalesce, taking on familiar shapes. The gaunt figure of the entity materialized in the corner, its red eyes burning into me. Sarah's translucent form flickered at the foot of my bed, her silent scream a haunting presence. And then the creaking started. Slow, deliberate footsteps from downstairs, echoing the beginning of my nightmare. I knew what was coming. The unseen assailant, the creeping dread, the final brutal blow. But this time, there was a new element, a personalized touch crafted by the app and the entity. As the footsteps reached my bedroom door, it slowly creaked open, revealing not the shadowy figure from before, but the monstrous doppelganger, its red eyes filled with a predatory hunger. "Hello again, Michael," it rasped, its voice a twisted echo of my own. "Ready for another performance?" I tried to scream, but no sound escaped my lips. My body was paralyzed, trapped in a state of utter terror. The doppelganger stepped into the room, the entity and Sarah watching with a silent anticipation. It held the knife aloft, its blade glinting in the faint moonlight filtering through my window. "This time," the doppelganger whispered, its cruel smile widening, "we're going to make it permanent." It lunged. The pain was excruciating, a searing agony that ripped through my chest. But this time, as the darkness began to consume me, there was a new sensation, a feeling of merging. As the doppelganger's red eyes burned into mine, I felt a part of myself, a dark, hidden part, being drawn out, becoming one with the monstrous figure. The darkness deepened, but within it I could still see I could see through the doppelganger's eyes, feel its twisted satisfaction, its hunger for more terror. I was no longer just the victim. I was becoming the tormentor. And as I looked down at my own lifeless body lying on the bed, a chilling realization washed over me. The endless night wasn't just a cycle of terror, it was a transformation. I was becoming a part of Nightfall, another player in its twisted theater of fear. The entity beside the bed chuckled, a sound of pure satisfaction. Sarah's silent scream seemed to fade into a mournful sigh. And through the doppelganger's eyes, I smiled. A wide, cruel smile that mirrored the entity's. The performance was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. And now, I had a starring role. Not just as the victim, but as something much, much worse. The footsteps started again, this time from downstairs. Another unsuspecting soul had downloaded the app. Another invitation to Nightfall. And I, or rather the thing that was once Michael, was ready for the next curtain call. The endless night had claimed another victim, and a new performer had joined the stage. The terror would continue, the cycle unbroken, in the endless, horrifying world of Nightfall. The app remained on the phone, waiting for its next player, promising the ultimate immersive simulation of fear, unaware of the true, terrifying reality it unleashed. The darkness held its breath, waiting for the next scream. The curtain remained open. My name is Ashley, and I've always been drawn to the darker corners of experience. Not in a morbid way exactly, but more out of a relentless curiosity about the edges of human sensation. Where does fear truly reside? What does the absolute limit of dread feel like? These are the kinds of questions that keep me up at night, not with anxiety, but with a strange sort of intellectual fascination. Most people satisfy these urges with horror movies or haunted houses, safe in the knowledge that what they're experiencing isn't real. But I've always found those things lacking. Too theatrical, too predictable. I craved something more visceral, something that could truly trick my mind into believing the unbelievable. That's probably why I became so obsessed with virtual reality. For years, VR was just a novelty, a clunky toy with limited potential. But recently, the technology had taken a quantum leap. The visuals were photorealistic, the haptic feedback was becoming incredibly sophisticated, and the immersion was almost complete. It was the perfect playground for my peculiar brand of exploration. I'd tried all sorts of simulations, flying through space, deep-sea diving, even a terrifyingly realistic zombie apocalypse. But there was one experience that had always lingered in the back of my mind, a forbidden fruit that I knew I would eventually have to taste. The sensation of falling from a great height. It wasn't about a thrill-seeking adrenaline rush. Quite the opposite, actually. It was about confronting pure, unadulterated terror. The kind of primal fear that's hardwired into our DNA, the instinct to survive a catastrophic impact. I wanted to know what that felt like, right up to the very last millisecond. After weeks of searching, I finally found an app that promised exactly what I was looking for. It was called Vertigo, and it was developed by a small, independent studio with a reputation for pushing the boundaries of VR realism. The app description was sparse, almost clinical, simply stating that it simulated a variety of freefall scenarios with extreme sensory fidelity. There were no user reviews, which was a little odd, but it only added to the intrigue. It felt like I had stumbled upon something truly underground, something not meant for the faint of heart. The price was steep, almost $100, but I didn't hesitate. This was an investment in my personal quest for the ultimate fear. The download was surprisingly quick, and the installation was seamless. The icon that appeared on my VR headset's menu was simple: a stark, white silhouette of a figure plummeting through an endless void. It sent a shiver down my spine, a mixture of anticipation and a sliver of genuine apprehension. I decided to wait until nightfall to try it. The darkness always amplified the feeling of immersion in VR, making the virtual world feel even more real. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the last rays of light faded from my apartment, I felt a knot of excitement tightening in my stomach. This was it. Tonight, I was going to face my greatest fear, or at least a meticulously crafted simulation of it. I cleared my living room, moving the furniture to create an open space where I could move freely without bumping into anything. I laid out my VR gear, the high-resolution headset, the haptic vest that promised to deliver realistic sensations of pressure and impact, and the motion-tracking gloves that would allow me to interact with the virtual environment. As I put on the headset, the familiar startup sequence of my VR system faded away, replaced by the stark logo of Vertigo. The screen went black for a moment, and then I was there. I found myself standing on a narrow metal platform, high above what looked like a sprawling cityscape. The level of detail was astonishing. I could see individual buildings, tiny cars, moving along the streets below, even the faint glint of sunlight reflecting off distant windows. The wind howled around me, and I could feel a subtle vibration through the haptic vest, mimicking the feeling of the wind buffeting my body. My legs felt weak, even though I knew I was perfectly safe in my living room. My palms were sweating, and my heart was starting to pound in my chest. The simulation was already working its magic. I looked down, and my stomach lurched. The ground seemed miles away, a dizzying expanse of concrete and steel. The height was almost unbearable to look at, even in a virtual environment. A wave of nausea washed over me, and I had to take a deep breath to steady myself. The platform I was on was small, barely enough room for me to stand comfortably. There was no railing, no safety net. Just me and the terrifying drop below. I took a tentative step forward, and the platform creaked ominously under my virtual weight. My mind knew it wasn't real, but my body was screaming at me to back away. Disembodied voice echoed in my ears, clear and calm. "Welcome to Vertigo. Please confirm you are ready to proceed." My throat felt dry, but I managed to croak out a yes. "Initiating scenario," the voice replied. Suddenly, the platform began to tilt, slowly at first, and then faster and faster until I was sliding towards the edge. I reached out with my virtual hands, grasping at empty air. There was nothing to hold on to. Panic surged through me, raw and primal. This wasn't just a simulation anymore. My mind had fully bought into the illusion. I was actually falling. The stomach-dropping sensation was immediate and intense. It felt exactly like that moment on a roller coaster when you plummet down the first big hill, but amplified tenfold. The wind roared in my ears, a deafening shriek that drowned out everything else. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the virtual wind still seemed to whip past my face. I could feel the haptic vest tightening around my chest, as if the air pressure was increasing with my descent. My body tensed up, every muscle screaming in anticipation of the inevitable impact. Time seemed to slow down, each millisecond stretching into an eternity. I had a fleeting thought. This is it. This is what true dread feels like. And then, the crushing force. It was like hitting a brick wall at full speed. Every bone in my virtual body seemed to shatter. A blinding white light flashed in my vision, followed by an all-encompassing darkness. The wind stopped, the pressure vanished, and the horrifying sensation of falling ceased. And then, nothing. My heart stopped, not just in the simulation but in my own chest. For a terrifying moment I felt absolutely nothing. No pulse, no breath, no sensation whatsoever. It was like a switch had been flipped, and I had simply ceased to exist. Then, just as suddenly, the feeling returned, A phantom pain, sharp and agonizing, shot through every part of my body. My limbs felt heavy and broken, even though I knew I was still lying safely on my living room floor. With a gasp, I ripped the headset off. My vision swam for a moment as my eyes adjusted to the dim light of my apartment. I was breathing heavily, my heart pounding erratically in my chest. Sweat plastered my hair to my forehead, and my hands were trembling uncontrollably. I felt wrong. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. The simulation had been too real, too intense. It had crossed some kind of invisible line, and I wasn't sure if I could ever uncross it. As I sat there panting and disoriented, I noticed a notification blinking on the small display of the VR headset. It was from the Vertigo app. With trembling fingers, I reached for the headset and squinted at the tiny text. It was a clinical report, devoid of any emotion. Subject experienced simulated fall from a height of 1,500 meters. Impact velocity: 198 miles per hour. Estimated time of death: 8.7 seconds post-impact. Physiological response within acceptable parameters. Acceptable parameters. The app was treating my near-death experience like just another data point. But for me, it had been anything but. It had been a glimpse into the abyss, and I wasn't sure I was ready for what I had seen. I closed my eyes, trying to shake off the lingering feeling of dread. But the phantom pain persisted, a constant reminder of the horrifying experience I had just endured. And somewhere, deep down, a tiny seed of unease began to sprout. What if it wasn't just a simulation? What if, for those brief, terrifying seconds, I had actually died? The clinical report on the headset display felt cold and impersonal, a stark contrast to the emotional maelstrom raging inside me. Physiological response within acceptable parameters. What parameters? The fact that my heart had momentarily stopped? The wave of phantom agony that still pulsed through my limbs? It felt like the app was mocking me, reducing my brush with simulated death to a mere data point. I finally managed to stand up, my legs still shaky. The familiar surroundings of my living room seemed alien, as if I had just returned from a long and terrifying journey to another dimension. The VR gear lay scattered on the floor, looking innocuous and harmless in the dim light. But I knew better. I knew the power it held, the ability to plunge my mind into the deepest recesses of fear. I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness. It wasn't just the memory of the fall, the stomach-churning drop, the crushing impact. It was something more profound, a sense that something had shifted within me, that the experience had somehow left a mark that wasn't just psychological. I walked over to the window and looked out at the city lights twinkling below. They seemed so distant, so detached from the terror I had just experienced. How could the world outside continue as if nothing had happened? How could I ever go back to normal after what I had just put myself through? I decided to take a shower, hoping that the warm water would wash away the lingering sensations of the fall. But even under the steaming spray, I could still feel it. A faint pressure on my chest, a ghostly ache in my broken virtual legs. It was as if my body remembered the trauma, even if my mind knew it wasn't real. After the shower, I tried to distract myself. I put on some music, made a cup of tea, and tried to lose myself in a book. But my concentration was shattered. Every few minutes, my mind would drift back to the platform, to the dizzying height, to the sickening feeling of weightlessness as I plummeted towards the ground. I kept replaying the moment of impact in my head, the blinding white light followed by the absolute nothingness. That brief cessation of existence was the most disturbing part. It was a glimpse of oblivion, a taste of what it might feel like to truly die. And it had terrified me in a way that no horror movie or haunted house ever could. As the night wore, On, I started to notice strange things, subtle anomalies that I initially dismissed as the after effects of the intense simulation, or perhaps just my overactive imagination. Once, while I was sitting on the couch, I felt a faint breeze on my face, as if a window had suddenly opened. But all the windows were closed and the apartment was still. I got up to check, but there was no draft, no explanation for the sudden gust of air. I told myself it was just a phantom sensation, a lingering echo of the wind rushing past me during the simulated fall. Later, as I was trying to fall asleep, I heard a faint, high-pitched whine coming from somewhere in the apartment. It was barely audible, like a mosquito buzzing in the distance, but it was persistent and incredibly irritating. I got out of bed and searched the entire apartment, but I couldn't find the source of the sound. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted off to sleep, the faint whine still ringing in my ears. The next day, the strange occurrences continued. My computer started acting up, displaying random glitches and error messages. My phone kept dropping calls, even though the signal strength was strong. These were minor inconveniences, but they added to my growing sense of unease. It felt like the world around me was subtly off. I tried to rationalize everything. The phantom breeze was probably just a trick of my senses. The high-pitched whine was likely coming from some electronic device I had overlooked. The glitches with my technology were probably just coincidences. But deep down, a nagging voice whispered that there was something more to it. I found myself constantly looking over, my shoulder feeling like I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hold a hidden presence. Every creak of the floorboards sent a jolt of anxiety through me. I knew it was irrational, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the simulation had somehow opened a door to something else. Driven by a need to understand what had happened, I started researching the Vertigo app. I tried to find the developer's website, but the URL listed in the app's About section led to a dead page. I searched online for reviews or mentions of the app, but there was virtually no information to be found. It was as if the app had simply appeared out of thin air. The lack of information only fueled my paranoia. Who had created this app? Why was it so realistic? And why was there no trace of it online? It felt like I had stumbled upon something that was deliberately hidden, something that wasn't meant to be found. I went back to the app's page on my VR headset. I scrolled through the permissions it had requested during installation. Most of them were standard for VR applications: access to the microphone, the camera, motion tracking data. But there was one permission that stood out, one that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up: access to biometric data. Why would a VR app that simulates falling need access to my biometric data? My heart rate, my skin conductivity, my brainwave activity. The clinical report about my physiological response suddenly took on a more sinister meaning. It wasn't just monitoring my reactions, it was collecting data. But for what purpose? Cold dread washed over me. What if this wasn't just a game? What if it was some kind of experiment? What if the goal was to push the boundaries of fear, to see how far the human mind could be pushed before it broke? I considered deleting the app, but a morbid curiosity held me back. I felt like I'd only scratched the surface of whatever Vertigo was, and a part of me, the same part that had driven me to try the simulation in the first place, wanted to know more. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back on the platform, falling through the endless void. Would jolt awake in a cold sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. Around 3 a.m., I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it again. The faint, high-pitched whine. This time it seemed closer, louder. I sat up in bed, straining my ears, trying to pinpoint the source of the sound. It seemed to be coming from inside my bedroom. I slowly got out of bed and started searching the room, my heart pounding in my chest. I checked my phone, my laptop, even the smoke detector, but the whine persisted, a constant, irritating drone that seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Then I noticed something strange on the wall opposite my bed. Faint, almost imperceptible shadow. It was long and thin, and it seemed to flicker and writhe in the darkness, even though there was no apparent source of light. I stared at the shadow, my blood running cold. It didn't look like any normal shadow. It seemed alive. It moved with a fluid, unnatural grace, as if it had a life of its own. As I watched, the shadow began to grow, slowly stretching and contorting into a vaguely humanoid shape. My breath caught in my throat. Fear, cold and paralyzing, gripped me. This wasn't a trick of the light. This was something real, something tangible. The faint whine intensified, growing louder and more piercing. It felt like it was drilling into my skull, making my teeth ache. And then, the shadow began to move towards me. Slowly, deliberately, it glided across the wall, its form becoming more defined with each passing second. I could now make out a head, a torso, long, spindly limbs. It looked like a distorted human figure, stretched and elongated, its features obscured by the darkness. I tried to scream, but no sound would come out of my throat. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by terror, as the shadowy figure reached the wall beside my bed. It stopped there, its form still shifting and writhing in the darkness. And then, slowly it turned its head towards me, even though I couldn't see its face. I could feel its gaze, cold and malevolent, piercing through the darkness. It felt like it was looking directly into my soul, seeing my deepest fears and vulnerabilities. The high-pitched whine reached a crescendo, and the shadowy figure began to extend a long skeletal arm towards me. Its touch felt like a shard of ice against my skin, sending a jolt of pure terror through my body. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow vanished. The high-pitched whine faded away, leaving behind only silence and the frantic pounding of my heart. I stood there for a long moment, my body trembling, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. Had it been a hallucination, a nightmare, or had the vertigo simulation somehow unleashed something real into my world? I didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain. I was no longer alone. Something had crossed over, something dark and malevolent, and I had a terrifying feeling that it wasn't going to leave. The icy touch of the shadowy figure's hand lingered on my arm long after it had vanished. I scrambled out of bed, my heart hammering against my ribs, and flipped on the lights. The sudden brightness felt jarring, but it did little to dispel the lingering sense of dread. The room looked normal, ordinary. My books were stacked neatly on the shelf, my clothes were folded on the chair, and the only shadow on the wall was my own. Had it all been a dream? A vivid hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation? I desperately wanted to believe that, to cling to some semblance of normalcy in the face of what I had just experienced. But the cold spot on my arm, the lingering feeling of being watched, told a different story. I spent the rest of the night huddled in bed with all the lights on, too terrified to close my eyes. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of leaves outside my window sent shivers down my spine. The silence was almost worse, punctuated only by the frantic rhythm of my own breathing. As the first rays of dawn crept through my window, casting long, pale shadows across the room, a fragile sense of relief washed over me. Daylight always seemed to diminish the power of the night's terrors, but even in the morning light, the memory of the shadowy figure remained vivid and unsettling. I tried to convince myself that it had been a product of my overactive imagination, a manifestation of the deep fear and anxiety that the vertigo simulation had triggered. But the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong persisted. The strange occurrences continued throughout the day, growing bolder and more frequent. The faint, high-pitched whine returned, this time accompanied by a subtle flickering of the lights in my apartment. I would catch fleeting glimpses of movement in the periphery of my vision, only to find nothing there when I turned my head. Once, as I was making coffee, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, even though I was completely alone in the apartment. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, but there was nothing there. Just the empty kitchen and the lingering scent of coffee. Sleep became a luxury I could no longer afford. Every time I closed my eyes, I was plagued by nightmares, vivid and terrifying visions of falling endlessly through a dark abyss. The shadowy figure lurking in the periphery of my vision, its unseen eyes fixed on me. The lack of sleep began to take its toll. I was constantly tired, irritable, and on edge. My concentration was shot, and I found it difficult to focus on even the simplest tasks. I started to withdraw from the outside world, avoiding phone calls and social interactions. I didn't want to talk to anyone about what was happening. Who would believe me? They would think I was crazy. I tried to find rational explanations for the strange events. Maybe there was a problem with the wiring in my apartment causing the lights to flicker and the high-pitched whine. Maybe the feeling of being watched was just paranoia. Maybe the shadowy figure was a hallucination brought on by stress and sleep deprivation. I even started researching sleep paralysis and hypnagogic hallucinations, hoping to find an explanation for what I had seen. But none of it quite fit. The shadowy figure had felt too real, too tangible, and the cold touch on my arm. That couldn't have been a dream. As the days turned into nights, the entity, or whatever it was, became more persistent. The whispers started, faint, unintelligible, murmurs that seemed to come from the walls, from the shadows from inside my own head. They were just below the threshold of hearing, but they were always there, a constant reminder of the presence that was now sharing my apartment. The feeling of being watched intensified. I would often catch myself staring at the shadows, convinced that I would see the shadowy figure lurking there. Sometimes I would swear I could see its form shifting and contorting in the darkness, even when I wasn't directly looking at it. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, trying to watch television, when I felt a distinct pressure on the cushion beside me, as if someone had sat down. I froze, my blood running cold, and slowly turned my head. There was nothing there. But the indentation on the cushion remained, a silent testament to the unseen presence. I knew I couldn't keep living like this. I was constantly terrified, on the verge of a breakdown. I had to do something. But what? Who could I turn to? I thought about calling a therapist, but what would I tell them? That I was being haunted by a shadowy figure that appeared after I tried a VR simulation of falling? They would probably recommend medication and a long stay in a psychiatric ward. I considered talking to a friend, but I couldn't bring myself to burden them with my increasingly bizarre and terrifying experiences. I knew they would try to be supportive, but I also knew they wouldn't truly understand. I was alone in this, trapped in a nightmare that seemed to be bleeding into reality. Desperate for answers, I went back to my computer and started searching for anything related to the Vertigo app. I tried different search terms, different websites, digging deeper into the obscure corners of the internet. After hours of searching, I finally stumbled upon a small online forum dedicated to discussing fringe VR experiences. Buried deep within a thread about hyper-realistic simulations, I found a single cryptic post that mentioned Vertigo. The post was from an anonymous user, and it was short and unsettling. Has anyone else tried an app called Vertigo? The falling simulation is incredibly realistic, but I've been experiencing some strange side effects since using it, like I'm being followed by something dark. The post was several months old, and there were no replies. But just seeing that someone else had experienced something similar sent a jolt of hope and terror through me. I wasn't crazy. Maybe. I tried to contact the user who had posted about vertigo, but their profile was inactive and I couldn't send them a message. It felt like another dead end. But the post had given me an idea. Maybe the Vertigo app wasn't just a simulation, maybe it was a gateway, a conduit to something else. I remembered the permission the app had requested, access to biometric data. What if it wasn't just collecting data? What if it was using that data in some way? What if the simulation had somehow attuned me to a different frequency, allowing me to perceive something that was always there, just beyond the veil of our reality? The thought was terrifying, but it also felt strangely plausible. The intensity of the simulation, the near-death experience, the way my heart had stopped. Maybe it had weakened the barrier between worlds, allowing something to slip through. That night, the entity made its most direct move yet. I was lying in bed, trying to ignore the faint whispers that seemed to be swirling around me, when I felt a cold hand grip my ankle. I screamed, a raw, primal sound that tore through the silence of the night. I tried to pull my leg away, but the grip was surprisingly strong, like ice-cold steel. I thrashed and kicked, my heart pounding in my chest, but the hand held firm. I could feel its icy touch seeping into my skin, sending a wave of nausea through me. Then slowly the hand began to pull me towards the edge of the bed. I clawed at the sheets, desperate to hold on, but the grip on my ankle tightened, and I could feel myself being dragged closer and closer to the floor. Panic surged through me. This wasn't a hallucination. This was real. Something was trying to pull me out of bed. With a surge of adrenaline, I managed to kick out with my other leg, hitting something solid. The grip on my ankle loosened, and I scrambled backwards, pulling myself away from the edge of the bed. I sat there, panting and terrified, staring at the spot where the hand had been. There was nothing there, but the cold sensation on my ankle lingered, a chilling reminder of the unseen presence. I knew then that things were escalating. The entity was no longer content to lurk in the shadows and whisper in the darkness. It was becoming more aggressive, more determined. I had to find a way to stop it, to send it back to whatever realm it had come from, but I had no idea how. I was just an ordinary person facing something extraordinary and terrifying. As I sat there in the darkness, a single thought echoed in my mind, a chilling realization that sent a fresh wave of fear through me. The Vertigo app hadn't just simulated a fall, it had simulated death. And maybe, just maybe, it had brought something back with me. The cold grip on my ankle was the catalyst. The terror it instilled finally snapped me out of my paralysis. I couldn't just cower in fear any longer. I had to fight back, even if I was facing something I didn't understand. I scrambled out of bed, adrenaline coursing through my veins, and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a thick, hardback book on my nightstand. I held it defensively, my eyes scanning the darkness, searching for any sign of the shadowy figure. The room remained still and silent, the only sound my own ragged breathing. Had it retreated? Was it waiting for me to lower my guard? I didn't dare to move. I stood there, clutching the book like a weapon, my senses on high alert. The cold spot on my ankle still throbbed, a constant reminder of the entity's touch. After what felt like an eternity, the silence was broken by a faint whisper, so close it felt like it was right in my ear. "You can't escape." The voice was raspy and chilling, like nails scratching against a chalkboard. It sent a fresh wave of terror through me, but this time it was mixed with a surge of defiance. "Yes, I can," I shouted into the darkness, my voice trembling but firm. "You're not real, you're just a side effect." The whispering stopped, replaced by a low, guttural chuckle that seemed to vibrate through the very air. The temperature in the room plummeted, and I could feel goosebumps rising on my arms. Suddenly, the shadowy figure reappeared on the wall opposite my bed. It was more defined now, its elongated limbs and distorted features clearly visible in the dim light filtering through my window. Its head tilted to the side as if it were studying me. Fear threatened to overwhelm me again, but I held my ground, clutching the book tightly. "What do you want?" I demanded, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure didn't answer, but its form began to shift and contort, growing larger and more menacing. Its shadowy hands extended towards me, their touch looking like tendrils of pure darkness. I knew I couldn't let it touch me again. I had to do something. Anything. Remembering the online forum post, I frantically searched my phone for the thread about vertigo. I scrolled through the messages hoping to find some clue, some weakness, anything that could help me understand what I was dealing with. As I scrolled, I noticed something I had missed before. Another user had replied to the original poster much later with a single chilling sentence. "It feeds on fear. The more afraid you are, the stronger it becomes." A cold realization washed over me. That's why it had gotten stronger. My fear had been fueling it, giving it power. I had to try to be brave, to not let it control me. Taking a deep breath, I tried to calm my racing heart. It wasn't easy, with the shadowy figure looming over me, but I focused on the feeling of the book in my hands, on the solid ground beneath my feet. "You're not going to hurt me," I said, trying to project an air of confidence I didn't feel. "I'm not afraid of you." The shadowy figure seemed to recoil slightly, its form flickering as if it had been struck. The low chuckle returned, but this time it sounded less confident, almost hesitant. I knew I had to press my advantage. If it fed on fear, then I had to starve it. I started to think about happy things, about my friends, about my favorite memories. I focused on the warmth of the sun on my skin, the laughter of loved ones, the feeling of accomplishment after finishing a challenging task. As I filled my mind with positive thoughts, the shadowy figure on the wall began to shrink, its form becoming less defined. The temperature in the room started to rise, and the oppressive atmosphere began to dissipate. The whispers faded away, and the high-pitched whine ceased. The only sound was my own steady breathing. Slowly, the shadowy figure on the wall dissolved into nothingness, leaving behind only the faint impression of darkness. I stood there for a long moment, my body trembling with exhaustion and relief. Had it worked? Had I managed to scare it away? I didn't know for sure, but for the first time in days I felt a glimmer of hope. I knew I couldn't stay in my apartment any longer. The memories of the past few nights were too vivid, too terrifying. I needed a change of scenery, a chance to clear my head and regain my sanity. The next morning I packed a bag and left my apartment. I didn't tell anyone where I was going, I just needed to get away. I drove for hours, until I reached a small, quiet town nestled in the mountains. I rented a cabin in the woods, hoping that the peace and solitude would help me heal. For the first few days, I was constantly on edge, expecting the shadowy figure to reappear at any moment. Every shadow, every strange sound sent a jolt of fear through me. But as the days turned into weeks, the fear began to subside. The nightmares became less frequent, and the phantom sensations started to fade. The world around me slowly began to feel normal again. I still had the Vertigo app installed on my VR headset. I couldn't bring myself to delete it. A part of me felt like I needed to keep it as a reminder of what I had faced and what I had overcome. One night, weeks after I had left my apartment, I found myself thinking about the app again. A strange curiosity, mixed with a healthy dose of apprehension, began to stir within me. I knew it was foolish, but I couldn't resist. I had to know if the entity was truly gone, or if it was just waiting for me to lower my guard. I took out my VR headset, my hands trembling slightly. I scrolled through the menu and selected the Vertigo icon. The familiar logo appeared, followed by the black screen. And then, I was back on the platform. The cityscape stretched out below me, the wind howled in my ears, and the familiar sense of vertigo washed over me. But this time, I wasn't afraid. I looked down at the dizzying height, and instead of panic, I felt a strange sense of calm. I had faced my fear, both in the simulation and in the real world. And I had survived. A disembodied voice echoed in my ears, clear and calm. "Welcome back to Vertigo. Ready for another descent?" I hesitated for a moment, a flicker of the old fear returning. But then, I took a deep breath and smiled. "No," I said, my voice firm and resolute. "I think I've had enough of falling." With that, I closed my eyes and mentally disconnected from the simulation. I took off the headset and placed it on the table beside me. I never used the Vertigo app again. But sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the shadows are long, I still feel a faint chill in the air, a subtle reminder of the darkness I encountered. And I can't help but wonder if the entity is still out there, lurking in the periphery, waiting for the next time someone dares to simulate the ultimate fear. Perhaps the true horror of Vertigo wasn't the fall itself, but the door it opened, the thin veil it pierced, allowing something from the other side to glimpse into our world. And maybe, just maybe, once that door is opened, it can never truly be closed. So the next time you're tempted to explore the darker corners of virtual reality, be warned. Some experiences might leave more than just a memory. Some simulations might bring something back with you, and some fears are better left unexperienced.